The needle slipped, and a single drop of blood bloomed on the dull gray silk. In a back room off Hanover Square, Honoria Wandesford mended the hem of her own ball gown by candlelight. The lute string was cheap, the lace at the neck had been turned twice, and the slippers waiting on the floor were yellowed at the toe. She pinned her late mother's silver pendant beneath the collar where no one would see it. In the cracked glass, she rehearsed the smile of a bride. It did not reach her gray-blue eyes. Across town, in the marble ballroom of Ledbury House, Viscount Aldous Carlyle was already adjusting his canary waistcoat and his lies. He had decided, 3 months before, that her £700 dowry was not enough. He had not yet told her. From a damask-curtained alcove above the dance floor, a tall man in a black Weston tailcoat watched the door for her arrival. The Duke of Ledbury did not smile. He leaned upon an ebony cane with a silver wolf-head pommel, and his ice-gray eyes did not leave the threshold. He had heard the rumor. He had read the ledger. He was waiting. What happened the moment the orchestra fell silent mid-quadrille, and what she stumbled into, sobbing, behind the wrong oak door? Before the story begins, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of justice, dignity, and love that arrives against all odds move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a member and help our channel. Spring of 1818 came late to Hanover Square, and the rain that had threatened all afternoon had not yet broken when Honoria Wandesford set the last pin into the hem of her own ball gown. She was kneeling on the bare boards of a back dressing room on the 3rd floor of her aunt's house, a room that had once held a governess and now held only a chipped washstand, a low stool, and the gown spread across her lap like the body of something she still loved. The candle beside her had burned to a finger's height. She did not light another. Tallow was counted now in this house, and she had learned to count with it. The dress had been her mother's, cut down twice, mended 4 times. Dull lutestring gray, a silk so cheap it had no shine left in it, only a tired mat the color of pewter that had been left out in the rain. The short puffed sleeves had been reset at the shoulder. The neckline, modest already, had been edged again with a strip of white lace she had washed in milk to bring back the color. Where the lace had torn at the bodice, she had drawn the threads together with stitches so small they vanished into the weave. No one would see them, that was the point. She did not stitch for anyone to see. She stitched so that no one could say. She rose, set the gown over the back of the stool, and crossed to the looking-glass that leaned against the wall. The glass was foxed at the corners. Her own face came back to her in pieces. Oval, pale, a scatter of freckles across the bridge of the nose that 12 summers of lemon juice had failed to fade, gray-blue eyes too large for the face beneath them, and around them, the dark lashes that her father had once said were the only inheritance she had got from him worth keeping. He had said it laughing. He had been drunk. He had been dead 3 years. She pinned up the coppery chestnut of her hair without a maid, a low simple chignon, a few loose curls left at the nape because her mother had worn it so. Then she lifted the silver pendant from its square of black silk and laid it against her throat. The pendant was no larger than a thumbnail, a flat oval of silver, engraved on the back with a date and a name no one in this house any longer spoke. The chain had been mended twice. She fastened it with steady fingers. From the floor below came the sound of her aunt's voice, raised in some small fury at a footman. From the floor above came nothing, because there was no one above her now. The servants who had remained slept in the attic only when the household was full, and the household had not been full since her uncle's death the previous Michaelmas. Honoria had inherited, with her aunt, a house that drained its own coffers like a slit purse. She had inherited also, by the slow attrition of 3 London seasons, a betrothal that everyone in the square assured her was a triumph, and that she herself, with each passing week, was less able to believe in. She practiced the smile. It was a small smile, the bride's smile, the one she would be expected to wear tonight when she descended the staircase at Ledbury House on the arm of Viscount Aldous Carlyle and took her place at the head of the receiving line, as though the engagement had been a settled thing for a year, and not a thing that, in the last fortnight, had begun to fray at every edge she dared examine. She held the smile in the glass. She watched it move. She watched her mouth obey her, and her eyes refuse, and she lowered her chin a fraction and tried again. The second attempt was worse. She gave up. She let her face settle into its own line, which was a quieter line than the one she had been trying for, and she found that she preferred it. A girl could go to a ball without a bridal smile. A girl could go to a ball with nothing but composure and her mother's pendant and a gown stitched by her own hand, and she could still be the most upright person in the room. Composure, she had decided some weeks ago, was the last article of dress one could not be deprived of. It cost nothing. It belonged to her. No creditor could enter it on a list. A knock came at the door, then the door opened without waiting. Polly, the under-housemaid, slipped in with a folded paper in her hand and the look of a girl who had run up too many stairs. "From the front door, miss," the boy said, no answer. Honoria took the paper. It was unsealed. The hand was one she did not know. She read it standing. It was 4 lines and a sum. The sum was £700. The lines, very politely written by a clerk in a counting house on Jermyn Street, begged to remind Miss Wandesford that the bond entered into in November last by Viscount Aldous Carlyle against the security of the said sum fell due upon the day of her marriage, and that arrangements for its discharge had not yet been communicated to the bearer. The clerk regretted the necessity of the inquiry. The clerk remained, with respect, her obedient servant. She read it twice. She read it a third time, more slowly, because the words did not at first arrange themselves into sense. £700 was her dowry. The whole of it. The figure had been printed in her mind since she was 16 years old, because it was the figure her father had set down in the settlement before he died, and had then, in his last year, been unable to touch. £700 was what she brought to the marriage. It was also, she now understood, what Aldous Carlyle had already spent. She folded the paper. She folded it again. She did not put it down. "Will there be an answer, miss?" "No, Polly. There will be no answer." The girl bobbed and went. The door closed. Honoria stood with the paper between her fingers and felt, very precisely, the small bright pain of a thing she had suspected for weeks, moving from the place where one suspects to the place where one knows. She had suspected since Twelfth Night. She had suspected when Aldous had failed to call upon her father's old friend at Lincoln's Inn to sign the marriage articles, though he had promised it twice. She had suspected when Lady Augusta Greatheed, who had no business with the Carlyles at all, had begun to be seen in their box at Drury Lane. She had suspected, most sharply, when Aldous's letters in the last fortnight had grown shorter and warmer and emptier, in the manner of a man composing in advance the excuses he intends to use. She crossed to the small fire that someone had laid an hour ago, and that had since gone almost out. She knelt before it. She did not burn the paper. She slid it instead into the bodice of her shift, against her skin, where her stays would hold it, because a woman who is about to walk into a room of 300 enemies should carry her evidence with her. Then she rose, lifted the gray gown from the stool, and dressed. She dressed without help. She had grown skilled at it. The stays first, tightened by means of a long ribbon and a hook screwed into the door frame for the purpose. The petticoat. The gown itself slipped over the head, the sleeves smoothed, the back fastened by a row of small covered buttons she had learned to do behind her own back by an inward twist of the wrist that her aunt had once called unfeminine, and that Honoria had since done every day of her life. The cream kid gloves to the elbow, soft from many wearings, the worn places along the inner seam turned in, the yellowed satin slippers, which had been white at her presentation 3 years ago and were now the color of old paper. A single gray ribbon threaded through her hair. The pendant, last, lifted to the lamp once and laid again against the hollow of her throat. She looked, when she was done, exactly like a girl who had been given nothing and had nevertheless contrived to appear. She did not look like a bride. She looked like a person. The carriage was at the door at 9. Her aunt, who was not coming with her, met her in the hall in a wrapper and a cap, with a glass of negus in one hand and a small dry mouth that had not bestowed a kindness on Honoria in 11 months. "You will smile," her aunt said. "Whatever passes, you will smile. The Carlyles are anxious to be in good humor with us this evening. You will give them no occasion otherwise." "I shall give them no occasion," Honoria said. Her aunt looked her over, from the slippers to the pendant, and her thin mouth thinned further. "You might have worn the pearls." "There are no pearls, aunt. They went in February. There were the garnet drops. They went in March." A small silence. Her aunt drank from the negus. "Well," she said, "the Lord provides. He has not been in evidence lately. Honoria, forgive me, aunt." She inclined her head, took up her cloak, and went out to the carriage before her aunt could find a fresh remark. The footman who handed her in did not meet her eyes. She had not paid him in 5 weeks. She had nothing to pay him with. She had told him so a fortnight ago, and he had said, very civilly, that he would stay until Lady Day, miss, on account of having known her mother. He shut the carriage door now with a small extra care, as though to say that the bargain still held. The carriage moved off. Honoria sat with her gloved hands folded in her lap, and the paper from Jermyn Street against her ribs, and looked out at the wet lamps of the square. It was not, she thought, an evening for terror. It was an evening for arithmetic. £700 borrowed against her dowry, in November, by a man who in November had not yet had her father's old friend at Lincoln's Inn sign the marriage articles. £700 spent, presumably, on tailors and gaming, and a box at Drury Lane, in which to seat Lady Augusta Greatheed and her daughter. Lavinia Greatheed had £30,000 in the funds. Honoria knew the figure because Lady Augusta took care that everyone in London should know it. £30,000 was a sum against which 700 could be discharged in an afternoon, with change for a string of pearls. It was, on the face of it, a simple piece of arithmetic. A man who had spent a girl's dowry before he married her required a new and larger fortune to cover the deficit. A new and larger fortune required the disposal of the smaller one. The disposal of the smaller one required, somewhere, the breaking of a word. She wondered where he intended to break it. She wondered when. She did not weep. She had wept twice in 11 months, both times in the same room, both times into the same cushion, and on the second occasion, she had decided that whatever else she lost, she would not lose the salt of her own face to any of these people. The pendant lay cool against her throat. Her mother had worn it the night her mother died. Her mother had said, in the small voice of the last hour, that a Wandesford did not bargain for her place at a table. A Wandesford took the place that was hers and held it. Honoria intended to hold it. The carriage came down through Bond Street, where the lamps stood closer, and into Berkeley Square, where the great houses had already begun to disgorge their carriages, towards Ledbury House in Grosvenor Square. She counted the equipages as they passed. 3 barouches, a landau with the Dunstable arms, a Newtown chariot lacquered the color of a wine bottle which she did not know. The line slowed. The line slowed again. They moved at a walking pace down the south side of the square, and through the streaming window Honoria saw, ahead of them, the long blaze of Ledbury House lit from cellar to attic, every window a square of yellow, the link boys' torches doubling and trebling along the curb, and at the door, beneath the portico, the figure of a footman in the Littleton livery of black and silver, motionless, as though the rain were not falling on him at all. And she had not been inside Ledbury House before. No one she knew had been inside Ledbury House for 7 years, because Demetrius Littleton, 4th Duke of Ledbury, did not entertain. He had returned from Corunna with a limp and a sabre scar on his chin, and an absence of taste for the rooms in which he had been an heir. He had closed the saloons, he had pensioned half the staff. He had let it be known, through the slow medium of his solicitor, that he meant to live as a private gentleman and to be referred to in the third person as little as the world would allow. The world had not allowed much. The world had spoken of nothing else for a season, and then, finding it could not extract him, had moved to other subjects. He was 34, he was unmarried, he was said to read. That he should have opened his house tonight, and opened it for the engagement ball of his second cousin Viscount Carlisle, was a thing the square had been discussing for a month. It was understood that the Dowager Duchess, his aunt and the only woman in England he was known to obey, had required it of him. It was understood also that he had agreed on a single condition, which was that he need not himself be seen. Honoria, who had no other thoughts to spare for him, had been grateful for the condition. She had not wished to be looked at by the cold Duke. She had heard the phrase too often in too many drawing-rooms. The cold Duke of Ledbury, a man who, the gossip ran, had not smiled in 7 years and had not danced in 9. She did not want a man like that observing her on the evening she meant to bear the smile of a bride she did not believe in. The carriage drew up at last under the portico. The door opened. A black-gloved hand was offered. She gave her own gloved hand to it and stepped down. The hall struck her first by its silence. It should not have been silent. It was full of people. There were footmen at every pillar, a small detachment of musicians on the gallery tuning very quietly, 2 girls in white going up the stairs ahead of her with their mother behind them, and somewhere above, through the open double doors of the first landing, the murmur of the saloon already filling. Yet the hall itself was hushed in the way certain great rooms are hushed, by sheer scale and by the absence of carpet. The black and white marble of the floor took every sound and gave it back smaller. The chandelier had not been lit. Only the wall sconces burned. The light fell sideways and made the busts in their niches look like witnesses. She gave her cloak to a footman. She climbed the stairs without hurry. At the top, a man she did not know, the master of ceremonies hired for the evening, took her name in a low voice and let her pass, and she stepped into the long blue saloon of Ledbury House and into the first stair. The stair was small and quick and not yet general. A woman she half knew turned, looked again, and bent to whisper to the woman beside her. A man with a quizzing glass lifted it, lowered it. A small group near the second window paused in mid-sentence and then resumed. Honoria walked the length of the room at the pace she had learned from her mother, which was the pace of a person who is neither hurried nor reluctant, and she came at last to the alcove between the third and fourth windows, where a small console table held a pair of branched candles, and where, by previous arrangement, Viscount Carlyle was to meet her. He was not there. She stood in the alcove. She waited. A clock in the next room struck the quarter. The musicians on the gallery in the great saloon beyond began to tune in earnest. A woman in puce velvet, very stout, with a tall purple turban and a brooch the size of a saucer, passed the alcove and looked Honoria full in the face, and then looked deliberately past her, as one looks past a small thing that has been left on a chair. Lady Augusta Greatheed. Honoria knew the turban. The turban moved on. A footman approached with a tray. She declined. Another quarter struck. A young woman she had been at school with, who had married a baronet in Wiltshire and not written since, crossed the room within 10 feet of her, and did not turn her head. The smile that Honoria had decided not to wear was not, in any case, being called for. She understood, with the small, bright clarity that had visited her in the dressing-room an hour before, that the evening had already begun and that she was not to be in it. She stood very straight. She did not change her face. Across the long blue saloon, on the side opposite the door by which she had come, there was a second door, narrower, set into the paneling and curtained on the inside in heavy damask, the color of old wine. The curtain was drawn back a hand's breadth. Behind it, in the small, darker room beyond, a single figure stood. She did not at first see him. She saw the curtain, and a darkness behind it, and a shape in the darkness that resolved itself, when she looked again, into the line of a man's shoulder against a candle held low, tall, very still, dressed entirely in black except for the white of the cravat. She could not see the face. She could see, by the candle, that he was looking at her. He had been looking at her, she understood, for some minutes. She did not look away at once. She held his gaze, or what she took for his gaze, for the length of time it takes a clock to swing twice. Then she inclined her head, the small inclination one makes to a stranger in a room one has not been formally given the right of, and she turned her face back to the door by which Aldous ought to have come. When she glanced again, the curtain had not moved, but the shape behind it had. The figure had withdrawn a step into the room beyond, so that only the edge of a black sleeve and the dull gleam of a silver thread waistcoat showed. He was still there. He was still watching. He had taken care, however, that no other person in the saloon should know it. The cold Duke, she thought, with a small dry surprise that was almost the first private amusement she had felt in a fortnight, had broken his condition. She filed the fact. She had no use for it. She had a more pressing arithmetic in front of her. She returned her attention to the door, and to the absence of Viscount Carlyle, and to the slow congealing of the room around the absence, as a pond freezes from the edges inward. A third quarter struck. The musicians began the first set. The double doors at the far end of the saloon opened, and the company began to move through into the great ballroom beyond. Honoria did not move. She waited in her alcove with the worn satin of her slippers cold through to the soles of her feet, and the folded paper from Jermyn Street pressing against her ribs in time with her pulse. At length, when the last of the company had passed her, when the alcove was nearly the only occupied corner of the long blue saloon, a thin gray man in spectacles detached himself from the wall by the inner door and crossed to her. He carried a black leather portfolio under his right arm. He bowed exactly the depth appropriate to a young lady of no consequence, neither more nor less. Miss Wandesford. Sir. Edmund Rushout, I have the honor to act for His Grace of Ledbury." She inclined her head. "His Grace," said Mr. Rushout, in the voice of a man reading from a document, "presents his compliments and bids me ask whether you would do him the kindness of taking a glass of orgeat in the small drawing-room before the dancing begins. He is aware that the hour is irregular. He believes you may find the room quieter than the saloon." She looked at the thin face above the spectacles. The face gave her nothing. "His Grace is very kind," she said. "I am, however, expecting Viscount Carlisle. His Grace is aware of that also, madam." There was a small pause, the smallest possible. Mr. Rushout did not blink. "I shall remain here," Honoria said, "until the Viscount comes." "As you wish, madam." He bowed again the same depth, turned, and withdrew. He did not glance towards the damask curtain on the far side of the room. He had no need to. Honoria stood in her alcove with her gloved hands folded one upon the other at her waist, and watched the empty saloon and the empty door, and felt, somewhere beneath the careful arrangement of her face, the first stirring of a thing she had not allowed herself for 11 months. It was not fear, and it was not grief. It was a small, steady heat at the base of the throat. It was the heat a person feels when, having long suspected that the floor is rotten, she at last hears it crack beneath her foot. She did not move from the alcove. She waited. Behind the damask curtain, the candle had gone out. But the figure was still there. She knew it, as one knows by the small change in the air of a room that a window has been opened somewhere out of sight. He had not gone. He was waiting also. He was waiting for the same door, and for the same man, and for the same thing she was waiting for, and what he intended to do when it came she could not have said, and did not, in that hour, think to ask. From the ballroom beyond, the music rose. The first quadrille, a laugh, very high, very pleased, that she recognized at once as Lavinia Greatheed's. A second laugh, lower, masculine, fond. Aldous. Honoria Wandesford lifted her chin a fraction. She set her shoulders. She walked, at the pace her mother had taught her, the length of the long blue saloon towards the open double doors and the music and the laugh, and she did not look once at the damask curtain as she passed it, though she felt, all along the bared skin between her glove and her sleeve, the cool, steady weight of a grey gaze that had not yet, in 7 years, been spent on any woman in London, and that was being spent now, in full and without economy, on her. The Ledbury House ballroom opened before her like a lit theatre, and Honoria Wandesford crossed its threshold at the precise pace her mother had once taught her, neither slow nor swift, neither pleased nor displeased, a woman entering a room as if the room had been awaiting her. 3,000 candles burned in the cut-glass chandeliers. The wax dripped, almost imperceptibly, onto the white plumes of the matrons below. She did not look at the curtain. She did not look at the gilded mirrors lining the long wall. She looked, instead, at the orchestra dais at the far end, where the master of ceremonies in plum velvet was raising his white wand for the next quadrille, and she counted, as she walked, the small mended places on her gloves so that her mouth would not tremble. Lady Marchmont was the first to greet her, because Lady Marchmont was always the first to greet anyone in trouble, the better to inspect the trouble at close range. "Miss Wandesford, how brave of you to come tonight." "I cannot think why bravery should be needed for a ball, ma'am." "No, no, of course not." The fan opened. The fan closed. The fan opened again. Only the heat. The crush. So fatiguing. Honoria curtsied and moved on. She passed the Duchess of Hereford, who looked through her as though she were window glass. She passed the Carrows, who turned their shoulders in unison so prettily it must have been rehearsed. She passed Miss Cunliffe, who had been her dearest friend at Bath 3 summers ago, and Miss Cunliffe lifted her bouquet of hothouse violets to her nose, and discovered, just then, an absorbing fragrance. The grey lutestring did not shine. It was the only gown in the room that did not catch a single candle. She found Aldous at last beside the third pier-glass, where he had positioned himself with care, because the pier-glass doubled his canary waistcoat and made it appear that 2 viscounts of equal splendor stood there together. He was speaking to a tall, plumed girl in heavy white silk, sewn with real pearls. The girl was laughing. The girl had a fan painted with cupids. Beside the girl stood a stout woman in a purple turban, broad and rouged, the brown eyes moving over the room as a butcher's eyes move over hanging meat. "Aldous." He turned. For the briefest fraction of a second, before the dandy mask resettled, she saw the flinch. It was the flinch of a man who had hoped, against the evidence of his own arrangements, that she would not come. Miss Wandesford? Miss, not Honoria, not my dear. Miss, you did not call yesterday. Did I not? How remiss. Nor the day before. My tailor, he said, with a small, precise smile, has been merciless. The plumed girl giggled. The mother in the purple turban did not. The mother in the purple turban was studying Honoria's hem, where a darn had been made in candlelight by a woman who could no longer afford a maid, and she was making, behind her dark ivory fan, a small private calculation. Lord Carlisle, will you not present me to your friends? He hesitated. It was the hesitation of half a heartbeat, but every woman who had ever waited for an introduction at a London ball would have known it for what it was, and so would every man who had ever withheld one. Miss Greatheed, Lady Augusta Greatheed. Miss Wandesford, an old acquaintance of the family. Old acquaintance of the family. She felt the silver pendant against her collarbone go suddenly cold, as though it had remembered, before she did, that her mother was dead and could not come into this room to put a stop to anything. Miss Greatheed. Miss Wandesford. The plumed girl curtsied exactly an inch less than the difference between their ranks required. What a charming gown. So very simple. So very brave. Brave again, Honoria said. How the word is fashionable tonight. Lady Augusta laughed, a short, hard laugh from the chest, the laugh of a Bristol cloth merchant's widow who had paid £20,000 to bring her daughter to Mayfair and meant to be heard laughing in it. My Lavinia is fond of plain speaking. She has been raised on it. We do not stand on ceremony in our house, do we, my love? We do not, Mamma. Lord Carlisle finds it refreshing. I find it refreshing, Lord Carlisle said. The master of ceremonies in plum velvet rapped his white wand on the dais. The orchestra raised their instruments. Couples began to drift towards the chalked floor for the quadrille. Honoria turned, very deliberately, to Aldous, because the quadrille was theirs, because it had been promised in writing on a card 3 weeks ago, because the card was at this moment in the reticule on her wrist. Our dance, my lord? He did not move. Our dance, she said again, softer. He looked, just once, at Lavinia Greatheed. Lavinia Greatheed inclined her plumes, the smallest fraction of an inch, in permission. And it was that small inclination, more than any word spoken in the next quarter hour, which told Honoria she had already been sold. Miss Wandesford, I fear I must beg your indulgence. Aldous, a small matter, of the moment, if you will permit me to address the room. Aldous, please. The word came out before she could stop it. It was the only word she said all evening that she would, afterwards, wish unsaid. It hung in the air between them for the length of a held breath, and the candles burned on as if nothing in particular were happening, and at the far end of the long blue saloon, in the damask alcove she had been careful not to look at, the heavy curtain stirred once and was still. He raised his hand. The master of ceremonies, who had been paid a guinea 3 hours before by a yellow-gloved footman acting for someone, lowered his white wand. The orchestra went silent on a half-bar. The violinist looked up startled, his bow still raised, and was hushed by the second violin, who had been told. The room turned. 300 faces, powdered, plumed, painted, turned in one slow movement, as a field of wheat turns under a passing wind, towards the third pier glass where a small dark-haired woman in a darned gray gown was standing beside a fair young man in a canary waistcoat, and the silence that fell was not the silence of attention, but the silence of appetite, because the tun had smelled, 3 weeks ago, what was coming, and had dressed itself accordingly. My lords, ladies. He had a pleasant carrying voice when he chose. He had used it in maiden speeches in the Lords on questions of the Corn Laws, and now he used it here. It is with the most particular happiness, and not without a proper acknowledgment of the delicacy of the circumstance, that I beg leave to announce my betrothal to Miss Lavinia Greatheed, only daughter of the late Mr. Josiah Greatheed of Bristol, and of Lady Augusta Greatheed here present. He paused. He was waiting, Honoria realized, for applause. It came. Slowly at first, from the Carlisle cousins by the door, then from the Hereford set, then from the Marchmonts. A few gloves clapped, a few more. The The sound rose like a small, unwilling rain. Honoria did not move. She had not moved since the wand came down. Her right hand was still half raised where it had been about to be placed in his for the quadrille, and she was aware, with the strange clinical clarity that sometimes attends a catastrophe, that her own fingers in the worn cream kid were trembling in a fine, continuous tremor she could not stop, like a leaf, like a struck bell. "Of course," he continued, smiling now, the smile widening, "I should not wish any earlier understanding, however informal, however entirely a matter of family expectation rather than of express engagement, to be the cause of any embarrassment. I trust the lady concerned will receive my felicitations on her future happiness elsewhere, with the same generosity of spirit with which I now offer them. Elsewhere. Family expectation rather than of express engagement. The lady concerned." She heard, behind her, somebody laugh. It was a high, bright, short laugh, cut off in the middle by a glove pressed over a mouth, and it was, she knew without turning, Miss Cunliffe, who had been her dearest friend at Bath 3 summers ago. Lavinia Greatheed offered her hand. Aldous took it, raised it, kissed the air above the knuckles in the French way. Lady Augusta in the purple turban tilted her head in a slow public bow, and the diamonds at her throat threw small white sparks. The room applauded again, louder this time, as London always applauds the winner. Honoria's lowered hand, the one that had been about to dance, closed at her side. Her gloved fingernails, through the worn kid, found her own palm and pressed, and went on pressing, until something underneath them gave. She did not weep, she did not faint. She did not, as the cleverer matrons in the room had wagered she would, stage a scene. She did the only thing her mother had left her capable of doing. She curtsied. She curtsied to the Viscount who had jilted her. She curtsied to Miss Greatheed who had bought him. She curtsied to Lady Augusta in her purple turban, who had paid the price. The curtsy was perfect. It was the curtsy of a duke's granddaughter who has been reduced to mending her own ball gown, and who has not yet, in any company, forgotten which she is. It lasted, perhaps, half a heartbeat too long. In that half heartbeat the ton, which had been ready to despise her, hesitated, because there are things in an English ballroom which even malice respects, and a curtsy held one beat past necessity by a ruined woman is one of them. She rose. "My lord, Miss Greatheed, Lady Augusta, I wish you," she said, in a voice that did not shake, that astonished her by not shaking, "every joy in the world." Then she turned. She did not turn towards the great front doors, where her absent aunt's carriage was not waiting. She did not turn towards the supper room, where she would have had to pass 30 pairs of eyes at close range. She turned towards the small side door behind the orchestra dais, the one the footman used to bring up champagne from the cellars, because she had once, 3 months ago when she was still a guest in this house, and still loved, slipped out through it for air, and she remembered it now as a drowning sailor remembers a rope. The orchestra, freed at last by a small inclination of the plum velvet wand, lifted their bows and struck up the quadrille without her. Couples began, after a moment of hesitation, to take their places. Miss Cunliffe accepted the hand of a hussar captain. The Duchess of Hereford swept past on the arm of her own cuckolded husband. Life in the room resumed. Honoria walked. She did not run. She walked the long blue saloon at the same pace she had entered it, the pace her mother had taught her, neither slow nor swift, and the small mended places on her gloves did not tremble now because she was holding them too tight against her skirts to tremble. Behind her, somebody whispered, "The gray gown. Did you see the gray gown? She must have mended it herself." In front of her, somebody else whispered, 2.20, and on the shelf, "Bristol money beats blood every time." Lady Augusta's laugh rang out, broad and pleased, against the high painted ceiling. She passed the damask alcove. She did not look. She kept her eyes upon the small side door, 6 paces, 4 paces, 2, and she felt, all along the bared skin between her sleeve and her glove, the cool and weighing pressure of a gray gaze that was no longer being economized, and she felt also, against the silver pendant at her throat, the heat of her own pulse rising at last, because the body which had refused to betray her in the center of the room was preparing, now that the door was almost within reach, to betray her the moment she was through it. Inside the alcove, behind the heavy-figured silk, Duke Demetrius Littleton stood as he had stood for an hour and a quarter, neither leaning upon his ebony cane nor easing the lame leg that wanted easing, watching. He had watched the master of ceremonies pocket a guinea at 9:15 and had not intervened. He had watched the second violin lean across to silence the first and had not intervened. He had watched Aldous Carlyle compose his face in the third pier glass for nearly 4 minutes before the speech and had not intervened. He had let it happen because he had needed to see how she would bear it, and he had seen. A curtsy held half a heartbeat past necessity. A voice that did not shake. A walk the length of a long blue saloon, at the pace a dead marchioness had taught her daughter 20 years before. My lord. Rushout had appeared at his elbow with the silent address of a solicitor who had been waiting in alcoves for noble clients since the reign of King George III. The black portfolio was under his right arm. The round gold-rimmed spectacles caught a single candle. She has gone through the cellar door. I saw. Shall I have the carriage brought? No. Your Grace. No, Rushout. The Duke moved at last. Only his head moved. His ice-gray eyes, which had not been spent on any woman in London for 7 years, came down from the height of Lavinia Greatheed's white plumes and rested, briefly, on the canary waistcoat of Viscount Carlyle, where it was bowing for the 3rd time over Miss Greatheed's gloved hand, accepting felicitations. Edmund, Your Grace, the mortgage on the Wandesford dowry, you spoke of it last Tuesday. Held by Mr. Moses Hart of Jermyn Street. £700 principal, 6 months arrears. The Viscount executed the instrument on the 14th of January last. 3 months ago. 3 months and 10 days, Your Grace. Before he ever called upon Miss Greatheed. A full month before, Your Grace. The introduction at Lady Sefton's was the 11th of February. The Duke's gloved hand, the black kid, tightened once upon the silver wolf head of the cane, and then relaxed. It was the only outward sign that anything had been decided. His gaming debts. Approximately 11,000 at White's, 1,200 at Brooks's, and a further 1,400 to private gentlemen. A list can be assembled by morning. Assemble it. Tonight, Your Grace? Tonight, Edmund. And the Greatheed settlements. The full schedule. I wish to know to the shilling what Lady Augusta has agreed to pay for him. Her solicitor is Cobbett. I shall send a man at midnight. Send him at 11. Rushout bowed and was gone before the curtain ceased to stir. Outside in the ballroom, the quadrille was reaching its second figure. The candles burned on. The Dowager Duchess Lady Theodosia Littleton, who had been seated all evening on a small gilt chair beside the great fireplace in the perpetual morning gown she had worn since the death of her younger sister 21 years ago, was watching, over the rim of a Sèvres cup, her nephew's alcove. She had watched it through the announcement. She had watched it through the curtsy. She had watched it through the long walk to the cellar door. The 7 strands of black pearls at her throat moved once, very slightly, as she swallowed her tea. She set down the cup. She rose. She crossed the ballroom on the arm of an empty footman, her ebony cane keeping the slow, measured time of a woman who had buried 2 brothers and a husband and a son, and still ruled a house. She did not stop at the Carlisle pier glass. She did not stop at the Greatheed plumes. She stopped at the damask alcove and lifted the curtain 3 inches with the silver pommel of her cane. Demetrius. Aunt, you watched it. I did. You did not intervene. I did not. For what reason? Because I wished to see her bear it. The dowager's ice-gray eyes, the same eyes, met his without flinching, and she bore it. That was a Wandesford curtsy, the old woman said, after a moment. I have not seen one in 18 years. Her grandmother gave one like it to the regent at Carlton House in '99, and he never forgot it. He spoke of it on his deathbed. I shall not forget this one either. What do you intend? Marriage, by special license, before Sunday. The dowager did not blink. She had been waiting, since the death of her son's wife in childbed 4 years ago, for some sentence very like this to be spoken to her in an alcove by her nephew, and now that it had been spoken, she received it as she received all things she had long expected, without surprise and without delay. The girl, does she know? Not yet. Where is she? In the corridor behind the cellar stair. She took the wrong turning at the bottom and is now, I believe, attempting the back passage that leads past the small library. How can you possibly know that? Because I had Pemberton place a fresh candle in that passage at 7 o'clock, and instructed her to remove every other one between the cellar and the green baize door. The dowager looked at him for a long, slow moment. Then she inclined her white head perhaps half an inch, which was, in her, the equivalent of another woman bursting into applause. "You have been planning this," she said, "for longer than tonight." "I have been planning this," he said, "for 1 hour and 26 minutes. And before that, I was merely waiting to see whether she was worth planning for." The dowager turned, with the same slow grace, and walked back into her ballroom, and the curtain fell, and the quadrille moved into its third figure. Honoria, meanwhile, had reached the bottom of the cellar stair and discovered that the cellar stair did not, as she had remembered, debouch into the kitchen passage. It debouched into a narrow, stone-flagged corridor, lit by a single candle some 30 paces away, and the candle was burning very steadily, as though it had been placed there for her by a hand that knew she was coming. She did not, at that moment, think about the candle. She lifted the dragging hem of the darned gray lute-string clear of the flags, and she walked towards the small flame, because there was nowhere else to walk. Her shoulders were still set in the carriage her mother had taught her. Her chin was still level. It was only when she was halfway down the corridor, and quite certain she was alone, that she stopped, and pressed both gloved hands flat against the cold stone wall, and bent her forehead onto the back of one hand, and discovered that her whole body had begun, silently and uncontrollably, to shake. She did not weep, not yet. The weeping was still gathering somewhere behind her eyes, slow as a thunderhead over a flat field, and she knew with the same clinical clarity she had felt in the ballroom that when it came, it would not be a ladylike weeping. It would be the weeping of a woman who had been raised to be loved and had not been loved, who had mended a gown by candlelight and worn it to a ball at which she had been publicly returned, like a parcel, to a sender who no longer existed. She straightened. She would not weep here. She would not weep within hearing of the orchestra. She would find a small room, a closet, a study, anything with a door that locked, and she would weep there for 5 minutes by the mantel clock, and then she would cease, and then she would walk through Hanover Square in her thin satin slippers to her aunt's house in Welbeck Street, and she would never enter Ledbury House again. The candle ahead of her guttered once in a draught from somewhere unseen. Beyond it, dim against the dark wainscoting, she made out the green baize door her mother had spoken of long ago, the door that separated the servants' world from the family's. And beyond that door, she remembered, lay the gun room and the billiard room and a row of small paneled studies along the east front, any one of which would, at this hour of a great ball, be empty and unlit and locked from inside. She pushed the baize door. It swung. The hinges were oiled. They had been oiled, although she did not know it, that morning by Mrs. Pemberton, who had been told at 6:30 in the housekeeper's room that a certain young lady might, in the course of the evening, have occasion to use that door, and that the hinges should not, in that event, betray her. Honoria stepped through into a corridor of polished oak. 8 paneled doors lined it. She did not know which led where. She tried the first. Locked. She tried the second. Locked. She tried the third. The handle turned beneath her gloved hand without resistance, as if it too had been oiled at 6:30 in the morning by a housekeeper acting on instruction, and the door swung inwards upon a long, dim room smelling faintly of cigar smoke and old leather and a recent fire. She stepped in. She closed the door behind her. She slid the bolt with shaking fingers. The bolt went home with a small, clean sound that was, after the long blue saloon and the laughter and the announcement and the curtsy, the most welcome sound she had ever heard in her life. The fire had burned low in the grate. A single oil lamp had been left turned down on the great mahogany desk. A Chesterfield of dark green leather stood at right angles to the hearth. The carpet beneath her satin slippers was a Persian of deep crimson, soft with age, and the room was utterly, blessedly, silent. She took 3 steps towards the hearth. She got no further. Her knees, which had carried her the whole length of the long blue saloon and down the cellar stair and through the stone passage, surrendered now without ceremony, and she sank forward onto the deep red Persian rug in a slow crumpling of darned gray silk, and she pressed the heels of both worn cream gloves against her eyes, and at last, in the small locked room she believed empty, Miss Honoria Wandesford began to weep. She wept as she had not wept since the morning her mother died. She wept silently, with her whole shoulders shaking, the way women weep who have been taught from the cradle that to weep aloud is to be commonly bred. She wept for the dance that had not been danced, and for the gown that had been mended, and for the name she had been called in a public room, the lady concerned, and for the small, high laugh of Miss Cunliffe behind a glove. She wept because she was 22 and on the shelf, and because Bristol money beat blood every time, and because she had said please. She did not hear, at first, the small, dry sound from the darkness behind the Chesterfield. It was the sound of a sulphur match being struck against the rough side of its box. A single yellow flame bloomed in the dimness at the far end of the room, sustained itself for the space of a slow, indrawn breath, and then settled into the glow of a fresh cigar drawn carefully alight. The match was shaken out. In the brief afterimage of its flare, before her eyes adjusted, Honoria saw, seated in the deep wing chair on the far side of the hearth which the high curved back of the Chesterfield had hidden from the door, a man. A man in a black wool coat, a starched white cravat pinned with a single dark blue stone that caught the lamp, a long lean hand in a black kid glove resting motionless on the silver wolf-head pommel of an ebony cane. He had been there the whole time. Her breath stopped in her throat. Her hands, still pressed against her face, slowly came down. The kneeling weight of her own body, sunk on the Persian rug in the center of a stranger's private room with the bolt drawn behind her, struck her all at once with the force of a second public announcement, and she went so cold she could not, for a long moment, even rise. The cigar tip glowed once and dimmed. "Do not stand on my account, Miss Wandesford," said a quiet, level voice from the darkness, in the tone of a man making a small administrative observation about the weather. "You appear to have had, this evening, a sufficiency of standing." Honoria did not lift her head at once. The voice had come from the high-backed Chesterfield by the cold hearth, and for one disordered instant she believed she had imagined it, that grief had at last loosened her wits and begun to furnish the dark with phantoms suited to her humiliation. Then the small flame of a sulphur match flared. It bloomed against a black-gloved hand, traveled to a beeswax taper on the side table, and steadied into a single yellow tongue that gave the room back its furniture and her, kneeling, to her witness. She saw the boot first, tall Hessian, tasseled, the right foot set a little awkwardly against the carpet, as though its owner had long since arranged terms with pain. Above the boot, black breeches. Above the breeches, the dark hem of a tailcoat cut by a hand that knew its trade. And above that, in the half-light, the long, pale face of the Duke of Ledbury, his ice-gray eyes fixed upon her with neither pity nor astonishment, only the cool, clean attention a surgeon brings to a wound. She moved to rise and could not. Her knees, which had carried her down 3 corridors and a back staircase, declined the office. The yellowed satin of her slipper had split along the side seam. She felt the cold of the parquet beneath the rug bleed up through her gown. "Forgive me." Her voice sounded to her own ear like a stranger's. "I mistook the door." "You did not." The Duke set the taper down with care. "You took the first door that opened. That is not the same as a mistake." He rose. He did so slowly, with the deliberation of a man who has measured the cost of each rising and decided to pay it without comment. The slight catch in his right knee was audible only in the small adjustment of his cane against the floor. He crossed to the door behind her, and she heard the soft, definite turn of the brass key in the wards. That sound, more than the match, more than the voice, returned her to herself. She put her palms flat against the carpet and pushed up to a sitting posture, and her chignon, which had borne much, surrendered another loose coil at the nape. "Your Grace must not." "Must not what, Miss Wandesford?" "Lock the door upon a woman alone." "I have locked it upon the corridor," he said. "There is a distinction." He came back. "In 10 minutes the corridor will contain Lady Tavistock and her elder sister, who have a remarkable nose for closed studies. In 12, it will contain Mrs. Greatheed. I do not propose to give either party the satisfaction of finding you upon the floor." He stopped 2 paces from her. He did not stoop. He did not offer his hand. He waited, in the way a horseman waits for a horse to decide it will not bolt. And Honoria understood, with the part of her mind that still functioned, that she was being given the dignity of choosing whether to stand. She set her hand against the heavy oak leg of the writing table and pulled. Her late mother's pendant struck the wood with a thin, cold sound. She gained her feet. The room tilted, righted itself, and presented her with the spectacle of the Duke of Ledbury, at a polite distance, regarding her cracked lace and her scorched cheek, and the small red mark at the corner of her mouth where she had bitten through the inside of her lip in the corridor. "Sit," he said. "There. The Chesterfield is nearer than your pride at present, and your pride will keep." She sat because her legs gave her no further choice. The leather was cool. He moved to the side table, poured a finger of brandy from a cut-glass decanter into a tumbler, and set it within reach of her hand. He did not press it upon her. He returned to the hearth, took down a clean cambric handkerchief from the inner pocket of his coat, and held it out. "For the eyes," he said. "Not the lace. The lace has done its part." She took it. The linen smelt faintly of bergamot and of the cold air of stables. She pressed it once to each eye, and the dark wet bloom upon the cambric shamed her less than she had expected. "Why are you here, your grace?" "Because in my own house I prefer to take my brandy in a room without dancing." In the dark. Candles draw company. I find I have had a sufficiency of company this evening. A small thing happened then in Honoria, almost beneath notice. The corner of her mouth, the one not cut, lifted by perhaps the breadth of a hair. He saw it. He did not remark upon it. He merely set his cane against the arm of a chair and seated himself opposite her, and the light of the single taper laid a thin gold edge along the ducal sapphire at his throat. "You will tell me," he said, "what you propose to do." "Do. In the next quarter of an hour, in the morning, in the week following. A woman publicly jilted in Hanover Square has a great many doors closed against her between midnight and breakfast. I find it useful, in such cases, to know which door is opened first." She stared at him. He spoke as though they were settling the disposition of a fallen hedge between two estates. "I had not thought so far, your grace." "Then think now. I will assist." The brandy stood untouched. She folded the damp handkerchief into a small, precise square in her lap, the way she folded the corners of a hem before setting a stitch. "In a quarter of an hour I shall leave by the service stair. My aunt's carriage stands in Brook Street. If I am quiet, she will not yet know. She knows." "How?" "Because I caused her to be told." He held up a hand against her color. "Not unkindly. A footman was sent, with my compliments, to inform Mrs. Aldous that her niece had taken faint in a back parlor, and would be conveyed home in a Ledbury carriage within the hour. Your aunt has therefore been spared the calculation of whether to wait for you. She is, I am told, already gone." The cambric tightened in her hand. "Then I am without conveyance." "You are not. The carriage is mine. The driver is mine. The footman who will hand you in is mine. You will arrive at your aunt's door in a manner that, by the time the morning papers are printed, no one will be quite certain whether to call ruin or favor. That is the most I can do for you in a quarter of an hour. The rest will require longer." "The rest?" "Miss Wandesford." He set his elbows on his knees and laced his fingers, and the ducal signet caught the candlelight along its crowned wolf. "You are this evening. By any reckoning the town will make tomorrow, ruined. Viscount Carlyle has seen to it. He has had assistance. I will not waste your time in cataloguing it. I will instead ask whether you would prefer to be ruined or married." The room steadied around the question. "You mistake me, your grace." "I beg you will not jest." "I have not jested in a great many years. I have not the leisure for it." "Then you are mad." "I am tired." He said it without complaint, as a man reports a fact of weather. "I am also, at present, the only person in this house in a position to render your situation other than what it is. You may take my offer, or you may take my carriage and refuse it. The carriage stands either way." She looked at him a long moment. The single taper had begun to gutter. He reached without looking and trimmed the wick with a pair of silver snuffers, and the flame steadied again, and she saw the small white saber scar at the point of his chin, and the lines about his eyes that no valet had ever quite smoothed away. "Why?" she said. Why? Why offer this? To me, tonight, in the dark." He was silent. She had not expected silence. She had expected the smooth ducal answer, varnished and ready, and instead, he sat with his fingers laced and considered the question as if it had merited consideration. "I watched," he said at last, "from the alcove behind the damask. I watched Carlyle stop the orchestra. I watched the tun arrange its face. I watched you set down your fan upon the empty chair before you turned, and I watched the small motion you made with the third finger of your right hand, as though to test whether a ring you had not yet been given was already gone. It was a precise, elegant gesture, It was the gesture of a person who has been taught to suffer with manners. I have a particular distaste for those who exploit such a training. She did not speak. She could not, for the moment. Carlyle, he went on, is in my debt. No, he does not know it yet. He will. The great heeds are in nobody's debt of consequence. That, in its way, is more dangerous, and will be addressed. None of this is your concern at present. Your concern at present is whether you will permit me to set my name across the front of your difficulty before the Morning Post. Your Grace, I am not a transaction. I have not proposed one. He inclined his head. A transaction has two parties calculating their advantage. I have set my advantage aside for the evening. I am, in plain English, asking you to allow me to marry you, by special license at my aunt's hand within the week, in order that Viscount Carlyle's evening's work shall be undone before he has slept upon it. The advantage to you is restoration. The advantage to me is mine to answer for. You need not consider it. And if I refuse, then you refuse. The carriage stands. The driver knows the address. There was no menace in it. There was no coaxing in it. It was the cleanest offer she had ever been made, and the cleanness of it frightened her more than threat would have done. She rose. He rose with her, slower, the cane taking the weight he would not give the knee. She walked to the writing table and set her hand upon its edge, not for support, but for the small, honest grain of the wood, which had nothing to do with anyone in the room. Your Grace, she said with her back to him, in my mother's house there hung a sampler that read, In haste lies sorrow. I have remembered it imperfectly all my life. I should remember it now. You should not. His voice came nearer. He had crossed the rug. He did not touch her. Haste tonight is the only thing that will preserve you. Sorrow will follow upon any course you take. Choose the course in which the sorrow is your own and not your enemy's. She turned. He stood a half pace from her, such enormity, the candle behind him, his face in shadow except for the ice-gray gleam of his eyes. I do not know you, sir. You will. Why should you wish to be known by me? He was quiet again. Then, with a deliberation she would remember to the end of her life, he removed the black kid glove from his right hand, finger by finger, and laid it upon the writing table at her elbow. The hand beneath was lean, marked across the back with a thin white scar that ran from knuckle to wrist. He did not offer it. He simply set it down at rest, the signet ring catching the taper. Because, he said, I have spent a great many years in rooms where I was looked at, and not one in which I was seen. You looked once across the ballroom before Carlyle spoke. You did not know you had done so. I did. A small sound escaped her. It was not a sob. It was the sound of something giving way that had held for too long without notice. He raised his ungloved hand. He did not take her face. He set the back of one finger, very lightly, beneath her right eye, where the last tear had not yet fallen, and drew the wetness away along the curve of her cheekbone, and his black-gloved left thumb, against the other cheek, completed the office. Do not weep further upon my carpet, Miss Wandesford, he said, and his voice had not altered, until you have decided what we are weeping over. The line, when she remembered it afterwards, was not the line a romantic novel would have given him. It was drier. It was therefore more dangerous. It found the small flint of pride she had not known was still in her, and struck at once. I shall not weep, she said. Then we have, perhaps, a bargain. I have not consented. You have not refused. A long second passed in which the taper hissed and the distant orchestra began a new figure 2 corridors away, indifferent to them both. What, she said, would the Duchess your aunt say? She would say a great deal. She is even now waiting in the small green room at the end of the gallery to say it. She has been informed of my intention. She has not approved it. She has not disapproved it. She wishes to inspect the woman in question before she decides which. Then I am to be inspected. You are to be received. There is a difference. She will know which she is doing. So shall you. He stepped back. He drew the glove on again, slowly, and the small intimacy of his bared hand was put away, with the same composure with which it had been offered. Take the brandy, he said, or do not. Then come with me. Whichever answer you carry into the green room is the answer the Duchess will hear, and the answer the morning will keep. She did not take the brandy. She took instead the cambric handkerchief, folded its damp square, and tucked it into the cuff of her glove against the bare skin of her wrist, where it lay cool and would dry against her pulse. She did not know why she did so. She would think upon it afterwards. "Lead on, your grace." He did not move at once. He looked at her with a long, level look in which there was, for the first time since the match had flared, a thing she could not name. Then he turned, unlocked the oak door, and held it for her to pass. The small green room lay at the end of the gallery, behind a single mahogany door which no servant approached without invitation. A pair of footmen in Ledbury livery stood at either side of the corridor entrance with their eyes fixed upon the opposite wall, and made of themselves a kind of furniture as the Duke conducted Honoria past. He did not offer his arm. He walked at her left side, half a pace behind, in the manner of a man escorting a witness rather than a bride. She understood this as a courtesy. He was placing her, in the eyes of his own household, where she would have to be placed if anything came of the next quarter of an hour. The Dowager Duchess of Ledbury sat in a high-backed chair beside a small fire that had been deliberately kept low. The chair had been turned 3/4 towards the door. Lady Theodosia Littleton did not rise. She was 61 years of age, narrow and erect as a cavalry saber, dressed in the perpetual black silk she had worn since her husband's death in '04, and her ice-gray eyes, the precise twins of her nephew's, did Honoria the singular honor of moving slowly over her once, from the broken stitch at the hem of the dull lutestring gray to the trembling silver pendant at her throat, and back again to her face. "You have brought her, Demetrius." "I have, ma'am." In the gown, ma'am. It seemed to me that any other dress at this hour would be a lie, and we have, between us, a quarter of an hour and no leisure for lies." The dowager allowed a single exhalation through her nose that, in a lesser woman, might have been a laugh. "Come here, child." Honoria went. She did not curtsy. She had judged, in the half-second between the door and the rug, that this woman would prefer a thing said straight to a thing performed, and she stopped 2 paces from the chair and met the dowager's eye, as she had not met any eye in the ballroom. "Your Grace." "Miss Wandesford, my nephew tells me he intends to marry you within the week, by special license, that I am to procure the license in the morning from Doctors' Commons through Mr. Rushout, and that you have neither accepted nor refused him. Is this correct?" "It is, ma'am." "You understand what is proposed?" "I understand that I have been ruined this evening in your son's ballroom, and that the Duke is offering me a name in exchange for my permission to use it to flay Viscount Carlisle alive. I understand that he wishes to flay him for his own reasons as well as mine. I understand that I am not the chief instrument of his purpose, only its occasion. I do not yet understand why I should consent." There was a small silence. The Duke, behind her left shoulder, did not move. "Demetrius," said the dowager, without turning her head, "leave us." "Ma'am, leave us. Stand in the corridor with your footman. Honoria Wandesford and I will speak." He bowed. He went. The door closed behind him, with the same careful, definite turn she had heard upon the study lock. The dowager regarded her a moment longer in silence. Then she lifted her ringed hand and indicated the small footstool at the side of her chair. "Sit, child. I will not have you standing for what I am about to say." Honoria sat. The black silk of the dowager's hem touched the dull gray of her own, and the contrast was not lost upon either of them. "My nephew," said the dowager, "is not a kind man. He is a just one, which is rarer and considerably less comfortable. He has not asked me to plead his case. I shall not. I shall instead tell you 3 things that you will not learn from him, and you will decide what you decide. The first is that he watched you across that ballroom for the better part of an hour before Carlyle opened his mouth. I watched him watching you. He did not know that I watched him. The second is that he ordered the horses put to before Carlyle had finished his second sentence. The carriage that will convey you home stood in the mews before the orchestra had been silenced 10 seconds. The third is that no Duke of Ledbury in 4 generations has offered marriage in any room of this house save one, and that room is the chapel in the east wing, and he proposes to take you to it on Friday morning at 8 o'clock. He does not propose this lightly. He proposes nothing lightly. It is not in his constitution." She paused. "Now, you will tell me, child, whether you are afraid of him." Honoria considered the question with the same gravity it had been asked. "I am afraid, ma'am. I am not certain it is of him." "Of what, then?" "Of being grateful, ma'am, for the rest of my life, to a man who set down his own advantage for half an hour in a dark room and called it nothing." The dowager looked at her a long second. Then she did a thing she had not done in the presence of a young woman, not of her own blood in 11 years. She set her ringed hand upon Honoria's, where it lay folded in her gray lap, and pressed it once. Then you will do, child. You will do very well. The gratitude will be his, in the main, and he will not call it nothing. She withdrew her hand. Mr. Rushout will wait upon you in Brook Street tomorrow at 11, with the license and the settlements. You will receive him in your aunt's drawing room. You will not require your aunt's permission, as you are of age, but you will permit her to imagine that you do. On Friday morning, a Ledbury carriage will fetch you at 7. You will be married at 8. You will breakfast in this house at 9, as Duchess of Ledbury. By 11, the Morning Post will have been sent to press with the announcement. By noon, Viscount Carlisle will have learned that his evening's work has been undone before he has finished his chocolate. Is this clear? It is clear, ma'am. You consent. Honoria drew one breath. She set the cambric handkerchief, still folded in the cuff of her glove, more firmly against the bone of her wrist. I consent. Then we have a bargain, child. Rise, I will summon him. She rose. The dowager rose with her, slowly, on the ebony cane that was the twin of her nephew's, and went herself to the door, and opened it, and said one word into the corridor. Demetrius. He came at once. He did not look first at his aunt. He looked at Honoria. He read, in the carriage of her shoulders, and the set of her chin, and the small dry place at the corner of her eye, where the tear had been wiped away, an answer he had not allowed himself to expect. Something moved at the back of the ice-gray eyes that was not triumph and was not relief, and that she would, in the years to come, learn to call by a name neither of them yet possessed. It is done, said the dowager. Friday morning, 8 o'clock, the chapel. Rush out in Brook Street at 11 tomorrow. The license is your business. The carriage is now hers. Take her down. He inclined his head. He offered, this time, his arm. She set her gloved hand upon the black wool of his sleeve. She felt, beneath the cloth, the steady warmth of a man who had not eaten since noon, and would not eat until midnight, and who carried his lame leg as a soldier carries a kit. They went out together past the 2 footmen, down the back stair the household used for the family, into the mews where a closed carriage stood with the Ledbury crowned wolf upon its door, and a pair of bays steaming gently in the lamp. He handed her in himself. He did not enter. He stood a moment at the open door, one black-gloved hand upon the frame, and looked at her where she sat upon the dark velvet within. You will sleep tonight, Miss Wandesford. You will not sit up. You will not write letters. You will not reread anything you have ever received from Aldous Carlyle. You will sleep. Do you understand me? I understand, Your Grace. On Friday you will not understand me. You will, by my reckoning, hate me a little. That will pass. Until then, you will sleep. He closed the door. He struck the carriage roof once with the silver wolf's head of his cane. The bays sprang forward. The lamp swung. Hanover Square receded behind her, and with it the orchestra, and the damask alcove, and the broken figure of the quadrille, and the small white face of Viscount Carlyle that had, an hour before, set itself against hers in public and bargained for her dishonor. In the carriage Honoria did not weep. She did not pray. She drew the Duke's cambric handkerchief from the cuff of her glove and held it in her bare palm, and the bergamot of it, mingled now with the cold of the night air through the window slit, was the last clear thing she remembered before the wheels turned into Brook Street. 3 hours later, in a small back room of Ledbury House, the dowager sat at a writing desk and dipped a steel pen into black ink. She wrote a single line upon a sheet of cream bath paper, sealed it with dark red wax, and pressed into the wax the private seal of the Littleton women, a wolf couchant beneath a crown. The note was directed to Mr. Edmund Rushout at Lincoln's Inn, and it contained 4 words and an hour. Buy the mortgage. Dawn. She did not ring. She carried the note down to the night porter herself, and stood while the man took his hat and went out into the dark towards Holborn. Then she returned to her chair beside the low fire and permitted herself, for the first time in 24 years, a small smile in an empty room. In Brook Street, in the narrow bed in the back attic to which her aunt had relegated her 3 weeks earlier, Honoria Wandesford lay upon her side, in the dull lutestring gray she had not yet found the strength to unhook, the cambric handkerchief folded against her cheek, and slept the dreamless iron sleep of a soldier who has been told, at last, by someone he is prepared to obey, that the watch is not his to keep. Above her, in a room she did not yet know existed, in a house she had entered only twice in her life, the Duke of Ledbury sat at his own desk in his shirt sleeves, with the candle burned almost to its socket, the ledger of Viscount Carlisle's known debts open before him, and a list, written in his own hand, of every door in Mayfair that would, by Friday noon, be opened to his wife and closed to her enemies. He set the pen down. He did not smile. He drew the black glove from his right hand once more, and looked at the bare white scar that ran from knuckle to wrist, and laid the hand, palm down, upon the page where her name had been written, 3 times, in the careful ducal script of a man who had at last found something he intended to keep. Mr. Edmund Rushout arrived at Ledbury House before the city bells had finished striking 8, and the footman who admitted him had the look of a man who had not slept either. The solicitor carried his black leather portfolio in his right hand, as he always did, and under his left arm a second bundle wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with red tape. He did not surrender either to the footman. He climbed the great staircase with the careful tread of a thin, tall man who had learned long ago not to slip on polished marble, and he was shown directly to the small breakfast room that gave onto the eastern garden. The Duke was already at the table. He was not eating. A pot of black coffee stood untouched at his elbow, and before him lay a sheet of foolscap covered in his own precise handwriting. He had been awake the whole of the night. The branch of candles at the corner of the table still burned, although the morning light had long since made them unnecessary, and no one had thought to snuff them. "Your Grace." "Sit, Rushout, eat if you wish. I find I cannot." The solicitor laid his portfolio upon the table and took the chair opposite. He removed his round gold-rimmed spectacles, polished them once on a square of grey silk, and replaced them with the gravity of a man preparing to read a will. "You will not eat either," the Duke said, "until you have told me what you found." "I will not, Your Grace." He untied the brown paper bundle. Within lay a stack of documents bound with green ribbon, and a second smaller packet sewn into oilcloth that had the look of something fetched from a damp cellar. He laid the green-bound stack on top. "The dowry," Rushout said. £700. £700, signed over by the late Mr. Wandesford in the autumn of 1810, and held in trust at Hors, under the joint signature of Miss Honoria Wandesford and her appointed guardian, until the day of her marriage. Held until the 3rd of January last. The Duke did not move. Only his ice-gray eyes moved, dropping from the solicitor's face to the green ribbon and back again. What was done on the 3rd of January? On the 3rd of January, Your Grace, Viscount Carlisle, presenting himself at Hors, in company with the lady's aunt and a power of attorney signed at the breakfast table on New Year's morning, withdrew the full sum and conveyed it the same hour to the chambers of one Mr. Pike of Jermyn Street, against a private bond bearing interest at 30 per centum per annum. 30, Your Grace. 3 months before the betrothal was broken. 3 months and 4 days. There was a small silence. Somewhere in the corridor, a clock began to strike, was hushed, and started over. "He pledged her own money," the Duke said, quite softly, "to a usurer, against the day he would no longer be obliged to marry her. That is the plain English of the matter, Your Grace. Read me the bond." Rushout untied the green ribbon. He read in his level legal voice, neither hurrying nor slowing for the cruelty of it, the sums, the dates, the seal of Mr. Pike, the witnessing of one Hezekiah Trubshaw, clerk. He read the schedule of repayment, which had not been kept. He read the renewal of the bond at Lady Day, at a higher rate, against further pledged expectations from a marriage that the Viscount had by then privately resolved never to make. He read the clause by which, in the event of default, Mr. Pike might enter at law upon any and all property held or to be held by Miss Wandesford in her own name. He folded the paper. The Duke had not blinked. "Buy it," he said. "Your Grace? Buy it all. Today." The solicitor inclined his head. "And the rest?" The Duke laid his hand, ungloved, upon the second packet. The white scar at his knuckle caught the morning light. He drew the oilcloth open with the patient care of a man who had once unwrapped despatches under cannon fire and learned to do it without haste. "The rest, Your Grace, took the night to gather, and is not yet entire. Read me what you have." Rushout drew out a sheaf of slips, of various papers, some printed, some scribbled in the loose hand of clubroom servants. some on the engraved letterhead of betting houses. He laid them out in order, as though dealing a queer kind of patience upon the breakfast cloth. Brooks's, £620, on faro, since Michaelmas. Wattier's, in the gaming room only, £490. White's, £310, exclusive of the wine bill. The Cocoa Tree, £220. There are further hand notes upon a Mr. Lush of King Street, moneylender, in the sum of £900. Upon a Mr. Solomon Garbutt of Berry Street, £1,800. Upon a Mr. Pike aforesaid, beyond the dowry instrument, a further £1,550, secured upon an entail he does not possess. The bond to his own tailor, Mr. Schweitzer of Cork Street, £340. The bond to his bootmaker, Mr. Hobie, £97. Sundries at Tattersall's, for a chestnut hack he could not afford, £400. There are also notes drawn upon his bank at Drummond's that have been twice refused. The bank does not yet know whether to call it a forgery or only a habit. He looked up. The total, Your Grace, as it stood at midnight, is £14,270. Repeat that. £14,270, Your Grace, with the interest still running. The Duke laid one finger, very lightly, upon the smallest of the slips. It was the bootmaker's note, for £97, signed in a hurried hand. He owed Hobie £97, he said, and was wearing the boots in my ballroom on Wednesday. He was, Your Grace. Buy them, the boots, buy the bond on them, and the bond on the coat, and the bond on the chestnut hack, and every paper in this list. Buy what is owed to Brooks's, to White's, to Wattier's, to the Cocoa Tree. Buy what is owed to Lush, and to Garbutt, and to Pike. Buy the tailor and the bootmaker and the saddler. Buy, if it is to be had, the lease upon his rooms in Albany. Pay in full, in good notes, today, without quibble of price. Bring me every scrap of paper, signed and witnessed, by sundown. Rushout drew breath. Your Grace, that will cost above 15,000. Then it will cost above 15,000. It is a great sum to lay out upon paper that, when consolidated in one hand, may be— It will be called in, the Duke said. All of it. In 7 days. The solicitor closed his portfolio with a small, precise sound. Then Your Grace intends ruin. I intend justice. In the law, they are not always distinguishable. They will be in this case. I will use no instrument that is not honestly his own. He pledged her money. He gave bonds. He spent what he had not. He signed his name to it. I do nothing but gather his name out of every dirty hand in London and place it in one clean one. Mine, Your Grace. Yours, and then mine, and then his own, when I lay it before him. Rushout was silent a moment. There is one further matter, Your Grace. Speak. The pamphlet. The Duke's face did not change. The pamphlet had been on a table in the small library since 6, brought up by a footman who had bought it for a penny from a hawker at the corner of Bond Street. It had been read, once, and laid flat with a paperweight upon it, as though the Duke had not wished to crease it before it was needed. Lady Augusta Greatheed. It is her work, Your Grace, although she is too prudent to sign it. The press is one she has used twice before, in the matter of a Miss Dymoke last season, and once upon a Miss Trant the season before that. The hawker has been spoken to. He had it from a man in a brown coat who paid for the run in cash. The man in the brown coat, her ladyship's second footman, Your Grace. You are certain. I am, Your Grace. He was followed. By whom? By a person of mine, whose name I will not trouble you with. The Duke nodded once. He set the paperweight aside. The pamphlet was a slim, ill-printed thing, 4 pages folded, headed in a leering type, a true account of the rejected jilt, lately to have been Viscountess C, with a verse beneath in heroic couplets of low quality. He did not open it. He pushed it across the cloth to Rushout. Buy the press. Your Grace? Buy the press it was printed upon. Buy the lease of the shop. Dismiss the printer civilly, with a quarter's wages, and put a man of mine in his room who will print nothing for the Greatheeds, ever, while I have breath. Find what other commissions are outstanding to that house from her ladyship, and have the bills called in. There will be bills. There will be bills, Your Grace. Pay them and own them. It shall be done. And Rushout. Your Grace. She is not to know who bought it. None of them is to know. Not Carlyle, Not the great Heeds, not the Ant, not Pike, not Garbett, not the bootmaker. Let every paper be transferred quietly into the names of small men of yours, in trust for an unnamed principal. They are to suspect nothing until the night I choose. You will tell me the night, your grace. I will tell you the night. The solicitor rose. He gathered his portfolio, and the green-bound stack, and the oilcloth packet, and the pamphlet, and bowed at the precisely correct angle. He had reached the door when the Duke spoke again, in the same low, even voice. Rush out. Your Grace, the £700. When you have it back in clean paper, do not credit it to my account. Open a new account at Whores in her name, Honoria Wandesford, spinster of this parish, until she is no longer a spinster. Place the money there. Add nothing. I will not have it said, even by myself in the small hours, that I bought her with anything she had not already owned. Rushout looked at him a long moment. Your Grace is very particular. I am very particular. It shall be as you say. The door closed without sound. The Duke sat alone with the cold coffee and the burning candles, and for some minutes did not move. Then he drew toward him the sheet of foolscap upon which he had been writing in the night, and with the same pen wrote across the top, in the careful ducal script that had 3 times now traced her name, a single line. Buy it all. Today. He folded the sheet once, sealed it with a blank wafer of black wax, and placed it beneath the paperweight where the pamphlet had been. It was an order to no one in particular. It was a vow he had made to himself, and meant to keep where his own eye could find it the next morning, and the morning after. Upstairs, in the blue guest room, Honoria had not yet slept. She had been put to bed by a maid she did not know, in a chamber larger than any room she had ever occupied, hung with hyacinth blue silk and curtained against the dawn. A fire had been lit, although the morning was mild. A tray with chocolate had been brought and taken away untouched. She had risen at first light and gone, in a borrowed wrapper of plain white wool, to stand at the long window that looked over Hanover Square, and she had been standing there ever since. She was not weeping. She had wept her allowance for a lifetime in another man's study the night before. She was very still and very pale, and her copper chestnut hair, taken out of its low chignon, hung over one shoulder in a single loose plait that no one had yet pinned for her. A discreet scratch at the door. Come. It was Mrs. Pemberton herself, with a second tray. The housekeeper was short and round, gray-haired beneath her starched cap, with the gentle brown eyes and red working hands of a woman who had carried other people's children to bed for 40 years. She set the tray upon a small table by the window without looking at Honoria's face, which was a kindness, and busied herself a moment with the cups. Toast, miss. And the chocolate fresh. His Grace's compliments, and if you would prefer tea, Mrs. Marchbanks will send it directly. Thank you. The chocolate will do. Will you sit, miss? I will stand, I think. As you wish, miss. Mrs. Pemberton did not leave. She drew a small footstool from beside the hearth and placed it close to where Honoria stood, in case the standing should fail. Then she set herself, hands folded under her apron, at a respectful distance, like a woman who would wait all morning if she were needed. Honoria looked at her at last. Mrs. Pemberton. Miss. You know what was signed in this house last night? I know, miss, that her ladyship the dowager required 2 candles, fresh ink, and the small green book from the strong room at 1:30 in the morning. The rest is not my business until it is. And then? And then, miss, I shall know what is asked of me, and do it. You are very plain-spoken. I am 60 next year, miss. I cannot afford to be otherwise. Honoria almost smiled. It was the first thing close to a smile her face had made in 18 hours, and it did not entirely succeed, but Mrs. Pemberton saw it, and looked away into the fire with a satisfaction she did not show. Mrs. Pemberton. Miss. Are the household to be told? They were told, miss, at 5 that a young lady of the family was within the house, and was on no account to be spoken of beyond these walls. The kitchen would sooner lose its tongue than displease his Grace. And what was said of me? Nothing was said of you, miss, that was not respectful. Cook said only that you had been thin in the cheek when you came down for the ball, and ought to eat. She has made you a custard, against my advice, which is that you ought first to drink the chocolate. Honoria looked down at her hands. They were trembling very slightly. She set them on the windowsill to still them. Mrs. Pemberton. Will you do me a small service? Many, miss. There is a trunk, at my aunt's, in Bruton Street. It contains very little, some books that were my mother's, a workbox, 2 gowns of no value, the linen I embroidered as a girl. If a man could be sent, a man has been, miss. Already. At 7, miss. His Grace gave the order at 6. The trunk will be at the servants' entrance within the hour, if it is given up, and if it is not given up, Mr. Hawking will return with it nonetheless, and the matter will be settled afterwards. I see. You do not yet, miss, but you will. There was a small silence, in which the fire made one small sound, and somewhere below a door closed. Mrs. Pemberton. Miss. What ought I to do today? The housekeeper considered this, with the gravity she would have given to a question of preserves. You ought, miss, to drink the chocolate while it is hot, to eat 1 piece of toast, even if it tastes of paper, which it will, to allow Suki to brush your hair and pin it, because the dowager will send for you before noon, and her ladyship does not approve of unpinned hair upon any female above the age of 12. To wear the muslin in the 2nd drawer of the press, which will fit you tolerably. You ought not, miss, to think upon anything beyond those 4 things until you have done them. Honoria looked at her a long moment. You speak as though I had stayed here before. You have not, miss. But you will, often, and it is best you begin as you mean to go on. Mrs. Pemberton. Miss. I am not yet. There is no. Last night was a paper that was signed in haste, in a room I had not been meant to enter, by a man who did not know me yesterday morning. It need not stand. The housekeeper folded her red working hands more firmly under her apron. It will stand, miss. How are you so certain? Because His Grace does not sign in haste. He has refused 11 young women of the first families since he came into the title, some of them with £30,000. He signed for you because he meant it, and His Grace, having meant a thing, does not unmean it. Drink the chocolate, miss. It is going cold. Honoria drank the chocolate. It tasted of nothing in particular at first, and then, after the 2nd mouthful, of chocolate. She ate 1 piece of the toast, which tasted, as Mrs. Pemberton had warned, of paper. She allowed Suki, who was sent for, and who arrived without speaking, to brush her hair and pin it low and simple, as she liked it. She permitted the muslin to be put upon her, which fit, as had been foretold, tolerably. By 11:30 she stood, plainly and properly dressed, in the center of the blue guest room, with her hands folded before her, and she was a young woman again instead of a wound. The summons came at 12. It came in the form of a footman in dark blue livery, who bowed at the door and said only, Her Ladyship the Dowager Duchess presents her compliments, miss, and will see you in the green drawing-room. Mrs. Pemberton, who had not entirely left her, gave her 1 small nod. Walk straight, miss, speak when you are spoken to, do not be sorry for anything. Yes, and if her ladyship offers you the larger of the 2 chairs by the window, take it. It is hers in the ordinary way, and means she has decided. Decided what? That you are not to be sent away. The green drawing-room lay at the front of the house, 2 flights down, and at the end of a long corridor hung with dim Vandycks. The Dowager Duchess Lady Theodosia Littleton was already seated when Honoria entered, very upright in her unrelieved black silk, her snow-white hair piled high, her 7-strand black pearl choker close at her long throat. The ebony cane that matched her nephew's stood propped against the arm of her chair. Her ice-gray eyes, the same as his, found Honoria at the door and did not release her. Come in, child. Close the door yourself. The footmen do not need to hear it. Honoria closed the door. Sit. There were 2 chairs by the window. The larger one, with its faded petit-point cushion, was nearer the light. Honoria, after the smallest hesitation, sat in it. The dowager noted the choice. Her mouth did not move, but something at the corner of it eased by a degree that perhaps only Mrs. Pemberton, had she been there, would have seen. You did not weep this morning. I had wept enough, your ladyship. Quite. There is a finite quantity. You have spent yours. Look at me, child. Lift your chin. That is the Wandesford jaw your mother had. I knew her. I did not know that, your ladyship. At 17. She had a finer hand at the harp than any of us, and a worse temper than she let on. You have her eyes. Your father was kind, which will do in a man where cleverness cannot be had. He left you very little money and a great deal of character. We shall make use of the second, since the first has been mislaid by other parties. Listen. Honoria sat very still. My nephew has signed a paper. You have signed it also. I have witnessed it. It exists. It will not be unsigned. Have you any objection to make, of conscience or of person, that I have not already considered and dismissed? I do not love him, your ladyship, nor he you as yet. That is not what was asked. Will you keep faith with the paper? A pause. I will, your ladyship. Good. Then we proceed. You will remain in this house. You will be presented as my niece by alliance until the announcement, which will be made at a time of my choosing. You will not, on any account, walk out of doors alone until I send for the milliner, which will be tomorrow. You will write no letters that are not first seen by me. You will receive no visitors except those I admit. You will not, particularly, attempt to see your aunt, who is at present being prevented from setting her foot upon my step by the simple device of hawking standing in front of it. Do you understand? I understand, your ladyship. You will, in 3 days, attend a small ball in this house. It will be called an engagement ball, because it will be one, although the engagement is not the one anybody expects. You will wear what I send. You will say what I tell you. You will dance once, with my nephew, although he dances seldom, and will hate it. You will stand beside me, and smile only at those at whom I smile. Is that clear? It is clear, your ladyship. There will be persons present on that evening whom you will wish very much to strike across the face. You will not. You will not give them so much. You will look through them as though they were window glass that wanted cleaning. You will leave the striking, in such forms as the law allows, to my nephew, who has been about that business since 6 this morning. Is that also clear? It is also clear, your ladyship. The dowager regarded her in silence a long moment. Then, with a slow deliberation, she lifted one long ringed hand from the head of her cane and held it out across the small space between the chairs. Then welcome, child, to a house that does not turn its people away when it is inconvenient to keep them. Honoria, after a very small breath, laid her own pale hand in the dowager's. The grip was dry and cool and surprisingly firm. There is one further thing. Your ladyship, my nephew will not come to you today. He will not come to you tomorrow. He will speak to you on the evening of the ball, in front of 700 people, and not before. This is not coldness. It is the only way he knows how to do a thing properly. Do not mistake the silence. I shall not, your ladyship. Good. Go now. Mrs. Pemberton has had Suki laying out a workbox for you, in case you wish to mend something with your hands while your head decides what it thinks. Use it. Idle women break. Honoria rose, curtsied, and went. She did not see the Duke for the whole of that day, nor for the whole of the next. She heard him, once, returning at 3 in the morning, his ebony cane making its single uneven sound on the marble below. She heard, twice, the front door admit Mr. Rushout, and once admit a man who spoke very low in the hall, and was taken away into the study, and not seen to leave. She mended a tear in the lent muslin with her fine embroidery calluses, and she set 3 new buttons on a chemise that had been her mother's, and she sat by the window in the blue room, and she watched Hanover Square, which had been the scene of her humiliation, do its ordinary daylight business of carriages and crossing sweepers and dogs. On the 3rd afternoon, Mr. Rushout was admitted at 4, and remained 1 hour exactly, and was let out at 5 carrying his black leather portfolio in his right hand, as he always did, but with an additional weight to it that bowed his thin shoulder. From the long window of the blue room, Honoria, who had no business to be watching, watched him go. He turned, on the step, and looked up. He could not have seen her behind the curtain, but he inclined his head, very slightly, in the direction of the upper floors, as though the courtesy were due to someone in the house whose name he had now learned to write. She let the curtain fall. In the study, 2 flights below, the Duke laid the fresh bundle of paper upon the long table. Every bond was now in his name. Every note from every gaming house, every bill from every tradesman, every line written in haste at a faro table, or in the upstairs room of a moneylender, every scrap that the Viscount Aldous Carlyle had set his fool's signature to since Michaelmas, every one of them was here, under his hand, transferred quietly through 11 small men into the one clean one Rushout had promised. £14,270, with the interest still running, and, beneath them all, in a thin, separate sleeve, the deed of the printer's press in Holborn that had set the pasquinade, and the receipted account at Hors, in the name of Honoria Wandisford, spinster, holding £700 in clean, unborrowed gold. He spread his ungloved hand upon the bundle. The white scar caught the late light. He did not smile. He never smiled. But somewhere, in a chamber 2 flights above him, a young woman in a borrowed muslin set down her needle, lifted her oval face from her work, and looked through her window at the square below, as though she had felt, without knowing why, that a great quiet engine had at that moment fitted its last cog, and begun, very softly, to turn. The first card came back on a silver salver before noon. Honoria saw it from the half-landing of Ledbury House, where she had paused to steady her hand on the banister. A footman in mulberry livery crossed the marble below, the salver held at the exact angle of long training, and on it lay a small white rectangle she recognized at once. Her own card, her own name in modest copperplate, returned without a word. She came down the last stair slowly. She lifted the card and turned it in her gloved fingers. Lady Sefton's house. The corner had been folded back, then deliberately smoothed flat, the way one returns a tradesman's bill that has been examined and rejected. Was a message given, Thomas? Her ladyship was not at home, your grace. The footman did not look at her. He had been trained not to look at her, and he was using that training now as a man uses a wall. Thank you. She placed the card on the salver again, face down. She walked to the morning room as though nothing had happened, and the long carpet under her thin slippers seemed to lengthen with every step. She sat at the rosewood writing table and opened her tablet of calls. Lady Sefton, Lady Cowper, the Countess of Bridges, Mrs. Drummond Burrell. She had written the names herself, in the same careful copperplate as the cards, the night the dowager had taken her cold hands between 2 heavy rings and said, "Tomorrow you will pay your respects. They must be given the chance to behave correctly before they are punished for behaving badly." She crossed off Lady Sefton's name with a thin pencil line. The second card returned a quarter of an hour later, Lady Cowper's. The corner had not even been folded. It had simply been laid back upon the silver, as if it had never been touched. A refusal so light it could not be answered. Thank you, Thomas. She drew the pencil line through Lady Cowper's name. By 1:30, her own name had crossed out 4 times under her hand. The Countess of Bridges was abed with a megrim that, the porter regretted, would last the season. Mrs. Drummond Burrell was unable to receive at present. Lady Jersey's house had not even taken the card. The door had opened, and the door had closed, and the news of that closed door would be in every drawing-room of Mayfair before the lamps were lit. There are no further calls upon the list, Your Grace. The Your Grace was new in the house. The dowager had instructed the servants the morning after Demetrius had locked the study door, and not one of them had stumbled over it since. They used it now with a careful neutrality. It did not warm her. Take the carriage round again, Thomas. The Honourable Mrs. Pertwee in Bruton Street, my godmother. Very good, Your Grace. He went. She rose and walked to the window and put her hand flat against the cold pane. Beyond the glass, Hanover Square went about its morning at the pace of an indifferent clock. A nursemaid walked 2 small boys in nankeen along the iron railings. A water cart trundled by, leaving a dark stripe on the dust. She watched the carriage roll out under the portico and knew already that it would return with the card. By 5 she had crossed out 11 names. 2 had refused her at home. 9 had not been at home in a way that closed the season. She did not weep. She had wept on the floor of his study on a Persian rug under his hand, and she found, with a kind of dry surprise, that the well in her had been drained that night and had not yet refilled. She went up to the blue guest room instead. It was called the blue guest room because the bed was hung with sapphire damask, and the walls were painted the color of a duck egg. It had been prepared for her on the morning after the betrothal, with the linen pressed and a low fire kept in despite the mildness of May. She found, on opening the door, that everything in it was now her own. Her trunk had arrived. She had not asked for it. She had left the Pertwee house in Brook Street 10 days before, in her grey lutestring and her mother's pendant, and one small overnight valise borrowed of the maid, the night her aunt had let her go to the Ledbury ball without even a chaperone, the night Aldous Carlyle had silenced the orchestra and silenced her with it. She had not been back to Brook Street since. The trunk stood now in the middle of the blue room's Aubusson carpet, its corded rope still tight, a label tied to the brass handle in her aunt's small spiked hand. She knew that hand. She had paid the school bills at 12 under that hand. She knelt by the trunk in her morning gown of pale lilac muslin, one of 3 the dowager's woman had laid out for her, and she untied the label. Miss Honoria Wandesford, to be deposited at the area door of Ledbury House, Hanover Square. The bearer is paid, no reply required. The area door. The servant's entrance. The same flagged step where the coalman left his sacks and the fishmonger his basket. The step her own father had crossed once, 40 years ago, as a young clergyman calling at the back of a great house to beg an introduction. Her aunt had given the order to the carter, written it in this same small spiked hand, and added the words, "No reply required." As one closes a coffin lid. She slid the label off the brass handle. She held it a moment between thumb and finger and read it once more, as though she might have mistaken it. She had not. She rose. She went to the bell and rang it. Mrs. Pemberton came up herself. "Your Grace?" "Mrs. Pemberton, the trunk was brought to the area, I think." "Yes, Your Grace. I had it brought up directly." "You opened it?" "No, Your Grace. The ropes were not loosed. Be so kind as to open it now, with me." Mrs. Pemberton's red working hands moved competently over the cord. The knots came undone, the lid lifted. Inside lay the whole of Honoria's life as the carter had received it from the back stairs of Brook Street, and it lay in a state that her aunt had not bothered to disguise. The gray lutestring ball gown had been folded in 2 like a dishcloth and pressed down to make room. Her 3-day gowns lay tumbled together with their hems creased. Her stockings were bald. Her 2 pairs of slippers had been pushed into the corners against the bare wood. Her father's prayer book, the only thing she had asked her aunt to send after if she did not return, lay on top of the pile, the leather cover scuffed, and the silk marker pulled half out. And under the prayer book, like a piece of refuse the aunt had not bothered to remove, lay a printed pamphlet, folded once. Octavo, the paper cheap, the ink wet enough still to smell of the press. Mrs. Pemberton saw it before Honoria did. "Your Grace," she said, "perhaps I might take that." "No," said Honoria. "Give it to me." Mrs. Pemberton hesitated. She had been 36 years in Ledbury House, and she had watched 2 duchesses, and she had a quick judgment of women. "Now please, Mrs. Pemberton." The housekeeper unfolded the pamphlet and laid it across Honoria's hand. It ran to 4 pages and was printed in the bad type of a Strand jobbing press. The title was set in a heavy black face that wanted to be funny. A modern dialogue, in verse, between a rejected jilt and her looking-glass, or The Lamentations of Miss W., late of Hanover Square, lately set down by a viscount of fashion in favor of a lady of larger fortune. She read the title once. She read it a second time. The script did not change. The 4 pages within were doggerel. The jilt spoke in stale couplets of self-pity. The looking-glass answered her with epigrams of contempt. The verses named no one outright and so could not be sued, but they named every one of them in the way that mattered. There were 4 lines about the jilt's gown that returned twice as a refrain. Her gown was gray, her face was gray, might, her hopes had aged a year a day. The author had signed himself only a friend of truth. The colophon gave the place of printing as Greek Street, Soho. She had expected to feel a heat in her face. She felt cool. She knew the verse already. She had heard half a couplet of it that morning from the lady's maid, who had brought her chocolate, recited unaware in the next room, before the girl had remembered who slept the other side of the wainscot. "Who is circulating this, Mrs. Pemberton?" "Lady Augusta Greatheed, Your Grace. The fact is known." "Known how?" "Her own woman bought 20 of them from the printer himself yesterday, and put them by the dozen into the hands of the linkmen at the doors of 3 assemblies last night. She did not pay the linkmen to take them, she paid them to be seen taking them. By morning every footman in Berkeley Square had read it, and every lady's maid in Grosvenor Square had recited it to her mistress over the toilette. And the printer is in Greek Street. So it says, Your Grace." "Thank you, Mrs. Pemberton." The housekeeper waited, neither moving nor speaking, in the way that women of her trade learn to wait. "Send Pickering down to the kitchen for a small coal scuttle and tongs, and bring them to me here. And the rest of these things," Honoria's hand opened above the trunk, palm down, "take them out and have them shaken and pressed and put by in the smaller dressing room. All of them. The prayer book to my bedside, the gray gown to be wrapped in paper, and laid in the bottom of the press. I shall not wear it again, but it is to be kept. Yes, your grace. The trunk itself to be returned to my aunt in Brook Street tomorrow morning. Empty, by the front door. A flicker passed across the housekeeper's face that was not quite a smile. Yes, your grace. And, Mrs. Pemberton? Your grace? Do not tell his grace of this paper, not yet. I will tell him myself, in my own time. The housekeeper inclined her head and went out. Honoria sat down on the edge of the great sapphire-hung bed with the pamphlet still in her hand. The afternoon light was sliding off the duck-egg walls towards the brass of the fire-dogs. A robin sang once in the square below and did not sing again. She read the pamphlet a third time, slowly, from the title to the colophon. She wanted to know it. She wanted to know it the way a general wants to know the ground over which he will be obliged to fight. When Pickering brought up the coal scuttle and the tongs, she thanked the girl and dismissed her. She knelt at the hearth in her pale lilac muslin and built up the fire with her own hands. She did it competently, because she had built up fires for years in a back room of her aunt's house when her aunt would not permit the maid to do it for her. She did not throw the pamphlet on the flames. She tore it first, page by page, into quarters, and then the quarters into eighths, and she laid the pieces on the coals one by one, and watched each piece curl and brown and lift and go. The page with the refrain of her gray gown took longest. The ink had been laid heavily there, and the paper was slow to take. She held it down with the tongs until it caught. She did not weep. When the last fragment had gone to ash, she rose and brushed the cinders from her skirt, and went and washed her hands at the rosewood washstand. The water in the basin was very cold. She held her wrists in it for a long moment, and felt the shock travel up her arms. Then she sat down again at the small writing table the dowager had had brought into the room for her, and she took a sheet of the house paper, and she dipped a pen, and she wrote. She wrote to herself, in a small clear hand, the kind of list a steward keeps. Greek Street, the printer, the buyer, the 20 pamphlets, Lady Augusta, Miss Greatheed, the Viscount, the mortgage, my aunt, the carter, the label. She read the list. She underlined 3 words. The printer, the buyer, the aunt. She folded the paper, sealed it with a wafer rather than the wax that would have shown the Ledbury crest, and slipped it into the small ivory case at her wrist. The case had been her mother's. It held now a list of 3 names she meant to ruin. A great quiet had come into her. It was the quiet of a person who has reached the bottom of a well and found, under her foot, not water but stone. She closed the lid of the ivory case with a small dry click. Then she crossed to the press where the dowager's woman had laid out her 3 muslins, and she opened the second drawer of the press, and she took out a small canvas housewife of the kind a country governess takes on a journey, and she laid it on the bed and began, almost without thinking, to fold into it the things she would need. 2 shifts, 2 pairs of stockings, the prayer book, the mother's pendant on its silver chain, the plain straw bonnet she had worn to the ball under her gray lutestring shawl, a small purse, with the 6 guineas the Duke had had sent up to her dressing room that morning, with no note attached, which she had not touched. She folded each thing very small. She did not let her hands hesitate. There was a convent of the English Benedictine nuns at York. Her great-aunt on her father's side had taken the veil there in 1779 and had died there in 1812, and the lay sisters there took in gentlewomen in distress for the price of their keep. 6 guineas would carry her on the mail to York and pay a week's lodging at the gate. She did not weigh it as a plan. She let it lie on the bed beside her as one lays out a knife on a table, knowing only that it is there to be picked up if it is wanted. She was tying the canvas housewife with its tape when the door of the blue room opened without a knock, and the Dowager Duchess of Ledbury came in. The dowager was in her black silk and her 7-strand pearls, and she walked with the ebony cane that matched her nephew's. She did not glance at the bed. She did not glance at the canvas. She crossed the carpet to the hearth and stood with her hands one upon the other on the wolf-head pommel and looked at the ashes there. "You have been industrious," she said. Honoria laid the housewife down without haste. "Madam, my woman tells me you returned 11 cards this afternoon. They were returned to me." "Yes." "And Pickering tells me you have burned a pamphlet." "Yes." "Without bringing it to me." "Yes." The dowager turned her head a quarter inch. Her gray eyes, which were her nephew's eyes, came to rest on Honoria's face. "That was correct of you. I should have done the same. I wish to see whether you would." She did not look at the canvas housewife on the bed. Honoria understood that she had seen it from the door, and that she was choosing, with the long discipline of her rank, not to see it. "I came to tell you," said the dowager, "that we go down to dinner in 3/4 of an hour. The Duke will be there. Mr. Rushout will be there with the day's papers. You will wear the gray silk that has been let out for you, and you will eat. You will eat with appetite even if you have none, because the kitchens will be watching, and the kitchens speak. After dinner you will sit with me in the small drawing room and we will discuss the engagement ball, which will be held in this house in 3 nights' time." "3 nights, madam?" "3. I have sent the cards out this morning. 240 of them, by hand, with the Ledbury seal. They will be opened in 240 houses before the tea is poured, and in most of them they will be accepted within the hour, and in those few where they are not accepted, the refusal will be remembered." The dowager paused. Her hand on the cane did not move. "2 of the names that refused you this afternoon are on that list. Lady Sefton is one, Lady Cowper is the other." Honoria's breath stilled. "They will come, madam. They will come. They will come because the card was signed by me and not by my nephew, and they will come because by tomorrow evening the news of the mortgage and of certain gaming notes will have reached the right ears, and they will come because a patroness of Almack's who declines a private ball at Ledbury House for an engagement of which the dowager has personally given notice, has made a mistake which she cannot afterwards correct." She looked once, finally, at the canvas housewife on the bed. She did not name it. She did not refer to it. 3 nights, she said again. "It is a short time. It will not feel short. I have been at the bottom of a well myself. In 1782, after my husband was killed at the Santas, and his cousin tried to take my son's title from us. I sat alone in a room not unlike this one for 2 days, and on the 3rd I rose and dressed and went down. You will rise also, because you have already understood, I think, what kind of woman is required for this house." She turned, the ebony cane finding the carpet without sound, and went out as quietly as she had come in. The door closed. Honoria stood very still in the center of the blue room. Her hand went to the canvas housewife on the bed and rested there. 3 nights. She did not untie the tape of the housewife. She did not, either, finish tying it. She left it where it lay, half open, half closed, on the sapphire counterpane, the prayer book showing at its mouth, and the 6 guineas wrapped in a fold of linen beneath. She walked to the window instead. Hanover Square below was beginning to draw on its evening. A lamplighter with his pole was moving slowly along the iron railings, and the gas in the new lamps came up one by one in soft yellow points. A gentleman in a curricle drove past at a smart trot and did not look up at the windows of Ledbury House. A pair of ladies coming out of the chapel turned their heads away. She watched them turn. She thought, with a precision that surprised her, of the Greek street printer. She thought of the carter who had brought her trunk to the area. She thought of the linkmen with the pamphlets in their hands. She thought of her aunt's small spiked handwriting on the label. She was still standing at the window in the failing light when Pickering scratched at the door to dress her for dinner. She turned from the glass. "Lay out the gray silk, Pickering. And the pendant. The pendant must be cleaned. There is a tarnish on the bezel I do not care for." "Yes, your grace." The girl curtsied and went to the press. Honoria stood a moment longer at the window. Then she crossed the room and lifted the canvas housewife from the bed and carried it to the press and laid it in the bottom of the deepest drawer, under the folded linen, where it would not be seen, but where she would know that it was. She closed the drawer. She did not lock it. She went down to dinner. The dining room was paneled in oak the color of dark honey and lit by 16 wax candles. The Duke stood at the hearth in evening black. The dowager sat already at her place. Mr. Rushout stood by the side table with his black leather portfolio in his right hand. The Duke turned at her step. His gray eyes went over her once, from the dressed hair to the cleaned pendant to the hem of the gray silk, and rested for a moment on her face. He said nothing of the pamphlet. He said nothing of the trunk. She understood that he had heard of both, in some other way, because nothing happened in his house that he did not know. He crossed to her and set his black-gloved hand under her elbow with the same exact pressure of 3 nights before, and he led her to the table. "You will sit at my right hand," he said. "From tonight onward, it is well that the room should learn it." She sat. He took the chair at the head. The dowager nodded once across the white damask and lifted her spoon to the soup. She ate. The veal was excellent. She did not taste it. The conversation moved between the Duke and Mr. Rushout in short, clear sentences about a matter of leases in Buckinghamshire, in the tone of two men aware that a woman at the table was being given time to gather herself by being asked nothing. She gathered herself. When the cloth was drawn and the dowager had risen, Honoria rose with her, and at the door of the small drawing-room she paused once and looked back across the long table at the man who sat at the head of it. Demetrius Littleton met her eyes. He did not smile. The cold Duke did not smile, but his black-gloved hand, which had been resting on the stem of his glass, moved a quarter of an inch, and the gold of the Ledbury signet caught the candlelight and threw a single small spark of fire across the white damask towards her. She inclined her head to him. She followed the dowager into the small drawing-room, and behind her, in the deepest drawer of the press in the blue guest-room, the canvas housewife lay folded and untouched, like a door she had chosen not, for the moment, to walk through. Mrs. Pemberton was waiting in the small drawing-room with the tea-tray. The dowager seated herself. Honoria seated herself opposite. The housekeeper poured the tea with her own hands, which she did only on certain occasions, and as she set the cup at Honoria's place she sank, without warning, into a curtsy so deep that the iron key-ring at her waist touched the carpet. "Your Grace," she said. The two words were spoken at a quiet pitch. They were spoken as one speaks the response in a ritual that has been observed in a house for 200 years. Honoria's hand stopped above the cup. She had been called Your Grace 50 times that day. Her own woman, the footman on the stairs, the porter at the door, the coachman handing her into the carriage. The words had moved over her without lodging. They had been the polite shell that the house had placed around her name while it waited to see what she would do. This was different. Mrs. Pemberton had served 2 duchesses before her. Mrs. Pemberton had washed the body of the late Duchess mother in 1808 and pinned the mourning brooch she still wore over her own heart. Mrs. Pemberton did not curtsy easily and did not call any woman Your Grace until she had decided, in the long iron quiet of her own judgment, that the woman before her was one. The housekeeper had decided. Honoria set her hand against the porcelain of the cup, very lightly, to steady it. She did not trust her voice at once. The dowager, across from her, did not move and did not speak, and her gray eyes had a different light in them than they had had in the blue room. "Thank you, Mrs. Pemberton," said Honoria. Her voice did not shake. Mrs. Pemberton rose from the curtsy, gathered the empty silver pot to her tray, and went out. The door closed. The fire spoke in the grate. Honoria lifted the cup and drank, and the tea, hot and faintly bitter on the tongue, went down like a sacrament taken in a chapel at the bottom of a well, where the stone underfoot is firm, and the air, though cold, is still breath. 3 nights, she thought. 3 nights, and a printer in Greek Street, and an aunt in Brook Street, and a viscount in a yellow waistcoat, and a girl in white pearls on the arm of her mother, and a quitted mortgage in a black leather portfolio, and a ball in this house with 240 cards already gone out under the Ledbury seal. She set the cup down without sound on the saucer. In a deep drawer 2 flights above her, a canvas housewife lay tied with a tape she had chosen, in the end, not to loose. She would not loose it tomorrow either, she knew, sitting there with the dowager's eyes upon her and the firelight on the 7 strands of black pearl at the old woman's throat, that she would not loose it at all. The door she had chosen not to walk through had closed of its own accord, and her hand was on another door now, and the hand on the other side of it, in a black kid glove with a gold signet over the knuckle, was already turning the key. The key turned in the lock with a sound no louder than a sigh, and yet Honoria felt it travel the length of her spine. Demetrius did not enter at once. He stood a heartbeat in the doorway, the lamplight catching the silver wolf-head pommel of his cane, the gold signet at his knuckle, the small saber scar on his chin. Then he stepped inside the blue music room and closed the door behind him, and the world outside, with its 3 nights of whispers, became a thing on the other side of oak. She had risen from the harpsichord bench without knowing it. The cerise silk of the gown they had laid upon her bed an hour ago lay still folded over a screen, the rubies still in their leather case, the tiara still asleep in its velvet. She was in plain white muslin, her coppery hair loose down her back, her feet bare on the cold parquet. She had been waiting. She had not known for what. You are not dressed, he said. No. The carriages are at the door. I know. He crossed the room with the slight drag of the right leg that no London tailor had ever been able to disguise. He stopped an arm's length from her. He did not touch her. He looked at her instead with the ice-gray eyes that had watched her, 3 nights before, from a damask-curtained alcove, and he waited. If I put on that gown, she said, and her voice surprised her by being steady, I cannot take it off again. If I walk down those stairs tonight on your arm, every door in London closes behind me, either as your Duchess or as something with no name at all. Yes. And you are still here. I am still here. She drew a breath that tasted of the wax candles and the cold green smell of the conservatory beyond. Then say it again, the thing you said in the study. A muscle in his jaw moved. He did not look away. I see you, he said. I have seen you since the spring you were 16, mending your mother's gloves in the Pulteney pew. I saw you the night Carlyle spoke your name, as if it were a coin he had grown tired of spending. I see you now. Tonight every fool in this kingdom will see what I have always seen. That is the only revenge I require. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, she crossed to the screen, and she lifted the cerise silk into her arms as one lifts a child. Send Mrs. Pemberton, she said. I shall not keep them waiting. He bowed. At the door he paused. Honoria. Yes. Do not be afraid of the room when we enter. They will be very quiet. Let them be quiet. That silence belongs to you. He went out, and the key turned again, and this time it turned to let her be alone with her own becoming. Mrs. Pemberton came with 2 maids and the leather case of rubies, and she did not speak above a murmur. The cerise silk slid over Honoria's shoulders like cold water that warmed in the wearing. The off-shoulder sleeves of gold lace were pinned. The sweetheart neckline lay flat against her collarbone, and there Mrs. Pemberton fastened the ruby and diamond collar with fingers that trembled only once. The tiara was set into the coppery chignon. The drops were hung at her ears. The bracelet was clasped at her right wrist over the long cream silk glove. At the last, Mrs. Pemberton lifted from its place around Honoria's neck the small silver pendant of her late mother, and made as if to lay it in the case. No, Honoria said. Under, beneath the collar. Where no one will see it, but I will know it is there. Mrs. Pemberton's red working hands paused, and she fastened the silver chain beneath the rubies, and she curtsied very low. Your Grace, she said, and the word, 3 nights old in this house, fitted at last. Downstairs, the great hall of Ledbury House was a quiet glitter of footmen in dark blue livery. The dowager waited at the foot of the staircase in her perpetual black silk, the 7-strand pearl choker at her throat, the ebony cane at her side, and her ice-gray eyes lifted when Honoria appeared on the landing. The dowager did not smile. She inclined her head once, the way a general inclines his head to a soldier who has carried the colors through the line. The Duke stood at the foot of the stairs in black wool, tailored by Weston, the silver thread waistcoat over slate-gray silk, the ducal sapphire pinning his cravat, the black kid gloves on his hands. He did not move as she descended. Only when she reached the last step did he offer his arm, and she laid her gloved hand upon it, and they walked together to the door of the ballroom. Beyond it, the orchestra was already playing. Beyond it, 200 candles burned in chandeliers that had not been lit since the late Duke's day. Beyond it, every name on the dowager's list, which was every name worth having, was waiting to see what manner of woman had been ushered into Ledbury House by night and never seen to leave it. The double doors opened. The orchestra did not stop. The dowager had instructed Vincenzo to continue through the entrance, as if the Duke of Ledbury, arriving with his betrothed, required no special fanfare. But the music played to a room that had stopped breathing. 200 heads turned, 200 fans paused. Somewhere near the card-room, a dowager dropped her lorgnette, and the small clatter on the marble was the loudest sound in the hall. Honoria did not look. She had been told by an old soldier not to be afraid of the silence, and she was not. She walked beside the Duke down the length of the floor between the parted rows of guests, and the cerise silk moved against her ankles, and the rubies at her throat caught the candlelight and threw it back doubled. She saw, without seeming to see, Lady Cowper near the orchestra, her gloved hand at her mouth. She saw Mr. Brummel, who never showed surprise, show it. She saw, at the far end of the room near the conservatory doors, a flash of cobalt blue tailcoat and bright canary waistcoat and gold lorgnette, and she did not turn her head. The Duke led her to the marble dais beneath the Ledbury Arms. There the dowager joined them, her own ebony cane striking the marble once, a sound which the orchestra at last took as its cue to lift the bow and fall silent. My lords, ladies, the dowager's voice was not raised. It did not need to be. Tonight I have the honor, as the eldest of the Littletons, to present the lady whom my nephew, by ducal warrant lodged with the heralds 3 nights past, has chosen as his wife, the future Duchess of Ledbury, Miss Honoria Wandesford, only daughter of the late Sir George Wandesford of Hanover Square. There was a beat of pure stillness. Then, from somewhere near the door, Lady Jersey began to clap. It was a deliberate sound, a single sharp pair of gloved hands, and she did not stop until Lady Cowper joined her, and Lord Alvanley after her, and at last the room, like a creature remembering itself, broke into applause that rose to the painted ceiling. The Duke did not smile. He inclined his head to the dowager, then to Honoria, and then he raised one black-gloved hand, and the applause stilled. "I am obliged to my aunt," he said, "and to all of you for the warmth of your welcome. There is one further matter of business which my solicitor will, with your permission, conduct in this room rather than in chambers. As it touches the honor of my future Duchess, I think it best that it be done in the open." A murmur ran through the crowd, and then it died, because the Duke's voice was the kind that asked for silence, and got it. Mr. Rushout stepped from the side of the dais, the black leather portfolio in his right hand, his round, gold-rimmed spectacles catching the chandelier light. He was a small, dry man among many splendid ones, and the crowd parted before him as before a magistrate. He walked the length of the floor without haste, and he stopped before the man in the cobalt-blue tailcoat. Viscount Aldous Carlyle was standing very still beside Miss Lavinia Greatheed, whose heavy white silk and pearl-embroidered bodice trembled where her breath was no longer steady. Behind them, Lady Augusta Greatheed, in her puce velvet and tall purple turban, had gone the color of old chalk. "My Lord Viscount," Mr. Rushout said, and his voice carried with the clean clip of a man who had once read sermons, "I act in this matter for His Grace the Duke of Ledbury. I have here 3 instruments. The first is the bond of mortgage, signed by your hand on the 8th of January last, by which you pledged the dowry of Miss Honoria Wandesford, in the sum of £700, to Mr. Asher Solomon of Jermyn Street, as security for your gaming debts. The bond is dated 3 months prior to your public renunciation of the lady in this house." A sound went through the room that was not quite a gasp. It was the small, involuntary noise of 200 people understanding the same thing at the same moment. Mr. Rushout did not pause. "His Grace has acquired this bond. It is herewith returned, marked paid in full, to the said Miss Wandesford, to whom in equity it has always belonged." He turned a quarter step and laid the folded parchment upon a small ebony table that a footman had placed at the edge of the dais. "The second instrument," he continued, "is a schedule of your lordship's gaming notes, drawn at White's, at Brooks's, at the Cocoa Tree, and at 3 private establishments in Pall Mall, between Michaelmas last and Lady Day. His Grace has acquired these notes in their entirety. The total sum is £14,270. The notes are payable on demand. His Grace makes that demand now, with 7 days for settlement, as is the custom among gentlemen." Aldous Carlyle's mouth opened. No sound came from it. His pink cheeks had gone the color of his canary waistcoat, and his soft hand had risen as if to find the gold chain of his lorgnette, and could not seem to recall where the chain hung. "The third instrument," said Mr. Rushout, "is an offer of marriage settlement, signed by your lordship and dated 4 weeks past, in favor of Miss Lavinia Greatheed, presented to her mother under your seal, in consideration of the sum of £40,000, to be paid into your hands upon the day of the ceremony. His Grace has caused a copy to be entered today with the Doctor's Commons, where, as your lordship will be aware, no settlement may stand if the bridegroom is at the moment of signature insolvent. I leave it to your lordship's honor to inform Miss Greatheed of her position." He bowed, he turned, he walked back to the dais with the same dry, unhurried tread, and he laid the portfolio at the Duke's feet, and he stepped down. For the space of 3 heartbeats, no one in the great ballroom of Ledbury House moved. Then Miss Lavinia Greatheed, who was 19 and not stupid, lifted her white-gloved hand from the cobalt-blue sleeve of her affianced husband as if she had discovered that the sleeve had begun to crawl. She lifted it slowly, deliberately. She let it fall to her side. She turned a quarter turn and her ostrich plumes shivered, and her brown eyes, lively still, found the Duke upon the dais. She made him a curtsy. She made the dowager a deeper one. She did not look at Honoria, because the look would have cost her what little remained, and Lavinia, even at 19, knew the price of a look. She walked from the ballroom alone. Her mother, Lady Augusta, in her puce velvet and her tall purple turban, stood a moment longer where the floor had emptied around her. Then she gathered the velvet in both hands and followed her daughter, and the heavy train of the gown dragged across the parquet with the small sound of something being swept away. Aldous Carlyle remained where he had been left. The Duke stepped down from the dais. The crowd parted again, with the same instinct it had used for the solicitor, and the Duke walked, with the slight drag of his right leg that no one any longer noticed, the length of the ballroom to where the Viscount stood alone. He did not speak. He stood at his full height before the smaller man and he waited. Honoria, on the dais, did not know afterwards what passed in Aldous Carlyle's face in that minute. She knew only that his weak chin trembled, and his watery blue eyes filled, and his soft hands rose and fell and rose again. And then his knees gave out from under him. He did not so much kneel as fall, the cobalt blue tailcoat collapsing about him, the canary waistcoat folding at the middle, the gold lorgnette clattering against the parquet. He knelt on the polished floor of Ledbury House before the Duke of Ledbury, and he turned his face up, and he looked past the Duke at the woman on the dais in cerise silk and rubies, and he opened his mouth. "Honoria, you will not address her grace," the Duke said. The voice was quiet. It carried. "Demetrius, for the love of, you will not address me either. You will rise. You will leave this house. You have 7 days. Use them to settle your accounts as a gentleman, or you will leave England as something less." Aldous Carlyle rose. He had to use one hand against the floor to do it. He found his lorgnette by touch, not by sight, because his sight was no longer reliable. He turned, and he walked the length of the parted crowd, and the crowd did not part for him so much as draw back from him, as from a man with the smell of plague on his coat. At the door he stopped. He looked once over his shoulder. He met no eye that would meet his. He went out. The doors closed behind him with the small finality of a coffin lid. The Duke stood a moment alone at the center of the floor. Then he turned, and he walked back through the silent room to the dais, and he held out his hand to Honoria, and he led her down the 3 marble steps, and he gave one quiet word to Vincenzo at the orchestra. The first chord of a waltz lifted into the air of Ledbury House. It was not yet, in 1818, an entirely respectable dance. Almack's had only the year before begun, on the strict authority of the Princess Leven, to permit it. To open a ball with a waltz was a thing the Dowager Duchess of Ledbury had not done in 40 years. She did so tonight. She did so by standing at the edge of the floor with her ebony cane and her ice-gray eyes, and by failing to call for a country dance. The Duke set his right hand against the silk at the small of Honoria's back. He took her gloved hand in his left. He looked down at her from his full height, and he said only, "I shall not be graceful. Forgive me the limp." "Forgive me my heart," she said, "which is making the same noise." He smiled. It was a thing she had seen perhaps 3 times in her life, and never in a public room, and it was for her alone, and the crowd around them, watching, understood that it was for her alone, and the crowd looked away as one looks away from a window into a private room. They danced. The right leg dragged on the turns, and he was not graceful, and she was not graceful, because her slippers were new and her breath was uneven, and yet about them the great floor lay empty, because no one in the ballroom of Ledbury House was fool enough to step onto it. The 2 of them turned alone beneath the chandeliers, and the cerise silk moved against the black wool, and the rubies caught the candles, and the silver pendant beneath the rubies, which no one saw, lay warm against Honoria's skin. When the music ended, he did not release her at once. He bowed over her hand. He kissed the cream silk of the glove above her knuckle. Then he released her, and the Dowager came forward with her cane, and the Dowager said, in a voice meant to be heard, "Lady Jersey, a country dance, if you please. The young people have stood about long enough." The ball resumed. The whispers, when they began, were of a kind Honoria had never heard before. They were the whispers that follow a victor, not a victim. She walked among them on the Duke's arm, and the great ladies who 3 nights before had refused her cards now contrived to be presented to her, and she received them with the quiet courtesy of a woman who had been taught civility by a mother she still wore under her rubies. She remembered every name. She forgot none. By dawn, the news was in every breakfast room from Berkeley Square to Bloomsbury. By the next morning, It had reached the clubs, and from the clubs the city, and from the city the moneylenders of Jermyn Street. Within 7 days, Viscount Aldous Carlyle was insolvent. On the morning of the 8th, the Duke's bailiffs entered the Carlyle townhouse in Curzon Street and inventoried it from cellars to attics. By the evening of the 9th, Aldous Carlyle, in a borrowed cloak and a hat pulled low, took the night packet from Dover to Calais. He did not return. Miss Lavinia Greatheed presented herself at Almack's on the following Wednesday. The Dowager Duchess of Ledbury was at the door beside the Princess Leven. The Dowager did not speak. She lifted her ebony cane perhaps half an inch, and the Princess Leven turned to her secretary, and the secretary, with a regret almost convincing, informed Miss Greatheed that there had been an error in the issue of her voucher, and that the error would not be capable of correction. Lavinia Greatheed left Almack's that night and did not enter it again. Within a month, her mother, finding the cards on her tray reduced from 40 a morning to none, retreated to Bristol, where Lady Augusta had been born above her father's chandler's shop, and where she lived out her years with a view of the river and no visitors. These things took place over weeks. Honoria heard them as one hears weather in another county. She had other matters in hand. She had Mrs. Pemberton to consult upon the linen, and the Dowager to consult upon the tenants of 3 estates, and Mr. Rushout to consult upon the settlement that would, on the morning of her marriage, place in her own name the £700 her father had once meant for her dowry, increased by the Duke's hand to 70,000. She had a wedding gown to choose, and she chose, after some thought, a thing of plain white satin with no pearls and no diamonds, because she had worn the rubies once, and they had done what rubies are for. A week after the ball, the Duke came to her in the blue music room in the late afternoon. The light through the long windows was the color of honey on old wood. The harpsichord was open. She had been playing, badly, a thing of Mr. Haydn's that her mother had once played well. She stopped when he entered. He crossed to her. He did not sit. He stood beside the bench, and he drew off his right black kid glove, finger by finger, and he laid it on the lid of the harpsichord. Then he drew off the left. He laid it beside the right. His hands were paler than she had expected. There was an old powder burn across the back of the right one, and a faint white scar along the inside of the left thumb, where, at Corunna, a French saber had once nearly cost him the hand. He turned the gold signet ring from his own little finger. He held it a moment between his bare thumb and forefinger. Then he took her left hand in his, and he drew off her glove, and he set the Ledbury signet, with its crowned wolf crest worn smooth by 400 years of Littleton fingers, upon her bare ring finger. It was too large. He had known it would be. He closed her hand into a fist around it, and he held the fist between his 2 palms, and he looked at her. "It will be sized this week," he said. "Wear it so until then." "Yes. It has not been off my hand since I was 21. "I know." He sat at last. He sat on the bench beside her, and the lame legs stretched out before him, and he looked at the harpsichord rather than at her, and he spoke as a man speaks when the words have waited a long time. "I was at the Pulteney Pew the spring you were 16, he said. "I had ridden up from Aldershot to settle my late father's affairs. I sat behind your family. You were mending your mother's left glove during the second lesson. You did not lift your head once. I watched the back of your neck where the chignon had come loose, and I thought, that is a young woman who will not be looked at, because she does not require to be looked at, and so of course she will never be seen. I was 28 years old, and I knew, in that pew, that I should marry you or no one. I was not in a position to ask. I was a younger son with a half-pay commission, and a brother who was going to live forever. I went back to Aldershot. I went to the peninsula. I came home, my brother having failed, after all, to live forever, and I found you betrothed to Aldous Carlyle. So I waited. I waited because I knew the kind of man he was, and I knew that a man like that, given time, would betray you in public, and I knew that I should be there when he did. I sat in the alcove that night because I had been sitting in alcoves for 4 years, waiting. You were never discarded, Honoria. You were always chosen. You have been chosen since the spring you were 16. It only took 6 years for the world to find it out. She did not weep. She had wept enough on a Persian rug 3 weeks before to last her a lifetime, and she did not weep now. She lifted his bare left hand from where it lay upon her closed fist, and she turned it over, and she set her lips against the old white scar along the inside of the thumb, and she held them there a moment, and that was her answer. He drew a long breath. He let it out. "There is a carriage at the door," he said. "I should like to drive you through the park. It is a fine evening." Yes. In the carriage, between Hyde Park Corner and the Serpentine, with the low June sun gilding the chestnut trees, and the horses moving at the slow pace prescribed by the fashionable hour, she sat beside him with the Ledbury signet heavy upon her finger and her gloved hand in his bare one. The hood was down. They were seen. They were meant to be seen. The carriages they passed slowed, and the bows that were made to them were of the kind that are made to a new dynasty in its first hour. He spoke once more, low, near her ear. "You were never discarded. You were always chosen." "I know," she said. "I think I always knew. I had only forgotten." "Then do not forget again." "No." The carriage turned at the Serpentine and started back. The light through the chestnut leaves moved across her cerise gown, for she had worn the cerise again, at his quiet request, and across the rubies at her throat, and across, beneath them, the small silver pendant that lay against her skin. In a back room in Hanover Square 3 months before, a girl in dull lutestring gray had mended her own threadbare ball gown alone, and had pinned her late mother's silver pendant at her throat, and had rehearsed before a fogged mirror a smile she no longer believed in, because she had thought herself a thing already half discarded, and had wondered, with the small flat wonder of those who have given up wondering, whether anyone in the world had ever truly looked at her, or ever would. She had her answer now. She wore the answer at her throat under the rubies, and on her finger under the silk, and beside her in the carriage in the long evening light, and within her in the slow, steady beat of a heart that had remembered, at last, that it had been seen all along. She had not been discarded. She had only, for a little while, been overlooked by everyone but the one man whose looking mattered, and being truly seen, she understood now as the carriage turned again into the gates of Ledbury House, was the only inheritance worth keeping, and the only crown worth wearing, and the only thing in this world that no jilting, no pasquinade, no closed door in Mayfair, and no turning of a key in any lock, could ever take away. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever, like Honoria, walked into a room in your plainest gray dress, certain you were invisible, only to discover later that someone had been watching you with quiet respect all along? Is there a moment in your own life when you were publicly jilted, dismissed, or written off as the rejected one? And what would it mean to you to hear a steady voice in the dark say that you were never discarded, you were always chosen? And when you think of the Ledbury signet sliding onto a bare finger, who in your life has truly seen you beneath the borrowed lace and the mended hem? Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about dignity, justice, and true love that arrives against all odds, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a part of our community and help the channel.